Hey there. So I did feel the need to put an emergency addendum to this podcast right at the beginning after having recorded with Wendell. You see, usually Broken Silicon podcasts are recorded on Sunday evenings and then edited and prepared and tweaked on Mondays and then put out to the patrons, of course, early once it's ready. But then, extra work needs to be done making sure it's ready for YouTube. There's no errors or anything. And so that's why it comes out to the public on Tuesday. But you see, on Monday, after me and Wendell had recorded, Intel put out this statement. They said that they have determined that elevated operating voltage is what is causing instability issues in some 13th and 14th gen desktop processors, and that their analysis of return processors confirms the elevated operating voltage is stemming from a microcode algorithm resulting in incorrect voltage requests to the processor, and they hope to have this fixed within a couple months. And I'm just going to say that my gut reaction to this is that this isn't the full story, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, Intel to this day has not acknowledged that there are laptop failures, despite devs putting their reputation on the line to say that's true, and despite Wendell putting his reputation on the line saying there are multiple server variants of Raptor Lake that are also failing. So think about it. At a minimum, Intel is failing to even acknowledge the full scope of processors. They're just saying desktop. They won't acknowledge laptop, and they won't acknowledge server. So if they won't acknowledge the full scope of the failures, why should we believe that they know the full scope of how to fix this issue? Furthermore, everyone I have spoken to in the industry thinks there's a deeper hardware or foundry level issue causing these problems, and Gamers Nexus believes the same thing, which on the note of those oxidation issues, Intel also put out a response to that today, saying that there were some of those issues in some manufacturing in 2023, but that has since been fixed, and it is unrelated to the instability issues we are seeing today, which is not a good answer, by the way. People are already outraged at that answer because that would mean that Intel didn't acknowledge a manufacturing problem last year, and it also still does not explain all of the failures that we are seeing. It could be a part of the failure reasons, but I do not believe it is the entire story. So here's what I think is actually going on. I see this as step one for Intel. They just need to stop the bleeding. They need to nerf down voltage and power on their processors as quickly as possible so that not as many are sent in for RMA over the next 6 months because they don't have enough to replace them. And then they'll put out some fixed version of the silicon. Maybe that's what Bartlett Lake is really for. And that is what they will use to RMA millions of Raptor Lake processors for the following year. I believe right now they're trying to put bandages over the problem, and then after that, they want to actually have the fix, and they can't afford to get the true fix out anytime soon. So that's what I think. I hope you enjoyed this quick take, and then I also hope you enjoy this episode with Wendell, where we talk about what we really think is going on with Intel Raptor Lake and much, much more. This podcast is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software. Then also use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 10% off tasty Vite Ramen and other great Vite products through the link below. And then also check out that other link below to see the AOC T8 Plus mini PC. And we'll talk about these sponsors more later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I am joined by, someone that's been on the show many times, and I got to say, every time that you're on, it's been a very well-coordinated time for what's happening in the market, whether it's a server release and one that you've tested or something else. But I can't think of a more prescient time for you to come on than when you are this year. So please, for completionist sake, as you always do, please introduce yourself and what you do both on and off YouTube.
I'm Wendell at Level1Techs. Computer janitor. I work on stuff. I make things go. I don't know what you want. I like working on computers, and I also get paid to work on computers, so that's fun. But mostly it's like problem solving stuff and troubleshooting and just helping people with their applications or working on this, that, or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Computer janitoring, basically.
Yeah, I gotta say, like, there are different ways you can like report or talk about, make content about computer hardware, and I think there's some people that just do like simple testing. I think there's people that just try to like get a story or point something out that no one else is noticing. But it is unique, I think, when you have someone, and important for the community, when you have someone like you who doesn't just want to point something out, but wants to prove it, and really wants to know actually why it's happening, because you can speculate about all different types of ways that something could be having a problem, but actually doing the work to know what is causing the problem, that's something that not a lot of people do, I would just say, honestly.
Well, it's, I really get tired of all of the, armchair speculation, and also just, it's like, okay, let's devise a test. Here's the hypothesis. What would satisfy this? Let's look for signal in the noise. And the whole thing, like if you're like for the Intel thing, it occurred to me from talking to people in the industry that do like the game dev stuff, just basic things like, have you ever tried grouping your data set by CPU and machine? And the answer was no.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that a lot of the tools built for collecting telemetry, like a lot of the game companies don't build their own tools for collecting telemetry. Some do on the server side. And sometimes there's different tools, like from the marketing side versus like the actual desktop. We want to know how long you play the game and what you're doing in the game is a different tool for data collection than your game has crashed, and we would like to have some insight into that. And so those people are not necessarily even talking to one another.
Right.
So the marketing team may not be aware of how many games have crashed, other than just, at a very high level, like we had, 1 million players and 4,000 of them experienced a crash at some point in the last 3 months or whatever. So I started digging into it, and the end of that was, this data isn't good enough because there's so much noise in that data and so much lack of data in that data. Because like if you get a blue screen or a really bad crash, it doesn't necessarily even phone home. So like, what are you going to do? And so then I started digging. It's like, okay, is there anywhere else these CPUs are used? And it just so happens that the answer was yes, they are used for game servers. And I think like high frequency traders and stuff use them too. Don't quote me on that. And so it turns out that folks that sell access to these systems also have trouble tickets and everything else going back to the beginning of time. And it's like, oh yes, system 137 has had these issues over its lifetime, which ultimately resulted in processor replacement.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, okay, I can dig through your old ticket database. Can I have access to that, please? And so fortunately, just the YouTube thing was nice because it was less of a rando reaching out and saying, hey, I'd like to do this. But it was more like, hey, I noticed that you used to list these systems for sale, or for rent, but now you don't. What happened with that? And then a little bit of conversation, and then a little bit more conversation, and a little bit, help me do this. But then also like deeper conversations about, well, there's a kind of psychosis here because it doesn't work like that. And does everybody up and down the stack understand it doesn't work like that, to do with like system parameters and that sort of thing? And so, it's a fun, wild time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, let me just throw in this reader mail here. Karma Cry writes in. He says, Wendell, how does it feel to be the belle of the ball? And will you bring the puppet court back in session to judge Raptor Lake? And it is interesting, like on that note, like belle of the ball, like I remember, like, honestly, it's been like half a year to a year, I would argue, of people I'm talking to in retail, and, people in distribution saying, it seems like there's a higher failure rate here. We think, like just someone who would run like a micro center is like, we notice a lot of returns, and there's more returns this month for the i9 than there was last month. But it's one micro center, it's one data point. You don't know all of it. And then once I had, like you said, once I had some developers just out of the blue messaging me like, hey man, it's bad. It's really bad. Like we have data here that says that if you have this i9, it's just going to break in 6 months, basically. And then I saw you put out the video that put the data together in some form or way. I remember one of the contributors to Moore's Law said, saying, I wonder if this story will blow up even more now. And I said, it's done. This is going to blow up now. All we needed was someone to have the data from multiple people. And I don't think I don't think it's gonna. Well, obviously, it keeps spinning up higher and higher and higher, and people are talking about it more and more. But I'm wondering, when you put that video out, did it surprise you how much attention it got?
Yeah, it really did. Partly because it felt like this was kind of a known issue since last year and the Outage devs and the Nvidia. I really thought something would happen when Nvidia actually put out a press release that said, this is not our drivers that are crashing. This is something in like the i7, i9 ecosystem. I really thought that would do something then, because I was working on this. I was working on it hard as far back as February, but working on, there were things that I put together last year that I ultimately was able to use and get some stuff out of, even from like 2023. And so, yeah, it does seem like the failure rate is atypical for an Intel enthusiast part. And it's also important that, you know, in a finger pointing type of context, yes, there are definitely problems with what motherboards are doing. You know, the motherboards are always chasing the performance, the best, the highest performance, and coloring outside the lines and that sort of thing. But there's a huge number of CPUs that are completely fine with that. Like, they have not experienced an issue. But there are also some number of CPUs that seems atypically high that are intolerant of that. And so this could be an issue that is a combination of things. Steve, Gamers Nexus, just put out a video that suggests that it's some type of oxidation, and it's a new type of, I guess, from the process and the process shrinkage, and it's a credible lead. And so everybody should check out that video, because that's really interesting. But again, it's not really 100% failure rate. But there are things that make people think that they're in an unstable situation when they might not actually be. Like, one of the things in the commercial context, and this is a little bit of a bombshell, I think, if Intel is going to say this publicly to gamers, but understand, like, in a commercial context, 13900, 13900K, KS, KF, sometimes there is no K, sometimes there is a K. It's kind of a large population that I was working with. Even for the K series CPUs, they were mostly being used in a way that is more consistent with the non-K part than the K part, i.e., none of the memory was running above 5600, period. None of the CPUs experienced temperatures in the hottest hotspot exceeding about 83 degrees C. So, you know, again, there's a lot, or putting this together is like, no, I don't want to talk about those. Nope, don't want to talk about those. Nope, don't want to talk about those. So some of that's on is me doing things. But even controlling for all of those things, sometimes you get kind of a large number of systems that were not stable at, 5600, which theoretically should be a supported memory speed, and with a multiplier cap of 56, and then everything else running Intel bone stock defaults as close as you possibly could. So it's really kind of a unique situation, because you have the same chips that are used on two different motherboards. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the data center context motherboards are perfect. They're not. But it's definitely a different voltage context. And it's definitely a different memory situation and all that. But the bombshell is that, you know, in the support, is reading over some of these tickets reaching back into early 2023. You know, some of the messaging lately from Intel support, technical support, is that in the OEM scenario, your warranty's only a year.
Yeah.
And so getting failures on these CPUs at like 14 to 18 months is makes for unhappy teeth grinding, which is probably why I have some of my data. It's like, one or two, that's fine. We've lost entire crops.
Yeah.
And so you get into looking at the memory thing, and it's like, well, wait a minute. In the fine print of the memory spec, it says that if the memory is routed, if you have a motherboard that has 2 DIMMs per slot routed, which is basically all of them except one or two, the only DDR5 memory speed you can expect is like 4400. And so if your CPU happens not to work at a memory speed above 4400, that's your tough luck. And so wait a minute. That's a little bit of a bombshell if you think about it, because, you know, Anatech, they did all their testing at 5600. 5600 is the highest supported speed. But you only get that speed if you have a situation unattainable in the real world, which is you have a motherboard that only has 2 DIMM slots. And so I have a feeling that must be incorrect. But that is what has been told to some of my contacts that helped me with some of the data is, yes, if it's stable, if it's not stable at 5600, but it is stable at 4400, that's in spec.
Oh, yeah. Well, and just, I mean, I have to say, the amount of times I've seen Intel fanboys in the comments say, I can run super fast memory on my gaming system.
Yeah, it's a skill issue, right? Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, you just don't know how to overclock. Yeah, but, and not realizing that, oh, maybe that is actually not something that will last for more than a month. I mean, I've actually seen a lot of arguments too with like Hardware Unboxed and some other YouTube channels about like they say they have their memories stable. They don't. I'm telling you they don't. I'm telling you it's going to degrade. That's a major selling point on Raptor, like, is how fast the memory can run. That would be a bombshell. For me, the biggest bombshell is just the scope of how many chips are breaking, because that to me would suggest that this could be a fundamental issue in everything that's Raptor Lake.
I can't recall another time when, except for maybe, remember when there was a couple of times when DDR4 was like, oh, you need to run 1.5 volts or something for DDR4, many generations ago. And that was sketchy. But other than that, I can't recall any other time where just using the XMP profile might lead to degradation, if that's what we're experiencing here. Certainly on the gaming side, like plotting, unit gaming time, which comes from the marketing database, versus the number of crashes that a user experiences, it's not a perfect system to do that. Like, you can find people that will try to game consistently, but as the crash rate goes up, they tend to stop playing the game. And so it's like, but we're fortunate in that the people that work on these systems in more of a commercial context tend to keep better notes and tend to have tickets in the system for, okay, this particular system had like 12 trouble tickets of some kind, and sometimes we found an issue and sometimes we didn't. The other thing that was really telling there is some of those systems were just having PCIe errors, which is also a thing that we saw on gaming systems. And the out of VRAM error may actually be some type of, not just a decompression error, but may actually be something related to PCIe, WHEA. One of the red herrings that I wasted a lot of time on is that Samsung SSDs throw a ton of PCIe errors until you get a firmware update. And you really need the firmware update if you're rocking Samsung SSDs. And so we had to go around and update firmware on a bunch of SSDs because that was missed. And so I found that, and then, their technical people had to go and update firmware on a lot of SSDs. But that also gave us a chance to install some more telemetry and get some more data and logging and stuff. So these are things that happen over a period of months. And yeah, just putting it together, it's like, it seems like something's not right here. And so Warframe, those folks actually dropped their chart, I think a day or two before my video, which is because I've been sitting on it for a while. Like, this can't be this, surely. And don't call me Shirley. And then so when they dropped their chart, I was like, yeah, all right, just launch. So it was interesting. It was really interesting. I definitely don't feel like the belle of the ball, but just more like, hey, the data is out there. Think about the data you already have in this context, and
this
then let us know.
This isn't a hypothetical question. Like, we have data showing this, guys.
Yeah. Well, and so people are doing that. Like, game companies are coming out now over the last couple of weeks saying, yeah, there is something to this. So.
Yeah, well, I imagine a lot of them didn't come forward publicly. They would just like email me or something because they don't know. I actually am a little confused because some of them, they were like, oh, I talked to my friends at another studio and they have all these issues. So clearly they were all talking amongst each other and knew there were all these problems. But I have to assume that a lot of people were hesitant to come out first with data because they were worried they were the only one, maybe, even though that's incredibly unlikely. Warframe has tons of players. And they didn't want to alienate Intel if they were the only one that had this. And I think it's something I have to worry about a lot when I like leak something too, is like, maybe I'm right, but what if I'm not right enough for people to remember I'm right? You know what I mean? And like, if you're a dev and you have this data and you're like, it does point to this being a major issue, but then everyone else has similar data, but it's actually at half the rate of your failure rate telemetry, you might go, well, and it's just quite within this thing where Intel can argue that we were overzealous and now they're going to get mad at us. But then once you put it all together, now they're just not afraid to talk about it. And I have to say, too, I think like you brought up NVIDIA, like why didn't people take it seriously when NVIDIA said it? I think a big reason that it finally blew up so much is, I mean, you were the vessel that people would take seriously, right? Like people will just say, I hate Intel or something if I leak this, it doesn't matter if I'm right, and then NVIDIA, I mean, come on, no one takes NVIDIA's shots at AMD or Intel seriously. NVIDIA talks so much shit about these companies, and half of the time they are lying, I think. That's why they didn't take them seriously, if you ask me.
Well, there definitely was, without, I say this, and I hope my sources don't take this the wrong way, but there is definitely, I perceive that there is an axe to grind because of the general unhappiness at the whole situation and how it's been handled. I mean, going back to 2023, this is not a new issue, dealing with this from 2023. Some of the fixes, fixes have been here, have some 14th gen CPUs. We don't know what happened with those 13th gen CPUs. And the reason that I was able to get my foot in the door was because it started happening with 14th gen CPUs as well. So that was you seem reasonable and you're willing to put in the work to figure out what's going on with the data. You have some it's like you can just reason for us and put it together. So it really is like the message is put the data together. But I also feel bad a little bit for some of the Intel folks, because there's a lot of computer janitors inside Intel that don't really care for, and it's draining to deal with the rabid just the rabid nature of it on both sides. You have it is amazing to me the number of people that have come out of the woodwork that will try to cling to any little thing to try to discredit what you're saying, or to take something that you said out of context and then twist it around and do something else. And it's just like, does Intel, does the Fortune 100 company really need, all I'm telling you is that there's something really interesting in the data here. And I think something is broken, but at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that's not broken. So if the motherboards are doing everything that Intel said, and it's cooking everything, I've got stuff in my database that says that people are playing this game 6 hours a day on, an i9 system and not experiencing any issues. But I've also got stuff in my data that says, it's a coin toss and you're not going to have a good time. And so it's assuming that the motherboards are doing all of the bad stuff that some of the chips just don't care, but some of them do. And so what's up with that? It's really weird. It's also, we've been doing this so long, it's easy to fall into the trap of, well, it's not the CPU. It would be really weird for it to be something with the CPU, because you can count on the CPU being it's on or
when
off.
I troubleshoot a broken desktop, the CPU is the last thing I check usually, because it almost never breaks. In fact, I just had my desktop's being repaired right now, and we almost thought it was the CPU, but at the last minute, nope, it wasn't. It was something with a liquid cooler with an SSD and a this and a that. It almost never is the CPU, right?
Yeah, I put together a little thread on the forum that gives you some stuff you can run, and it's Y-Cruncher isn't terrible, but there were a surprising number of machines that could pass Y-Cruncher. But if you just had a 10 gigabyte file that was compressed, and you just uncompressed it to an SSD, and you recompressed it, and you uncompressed it, and you recompressed it 2 or 3 times on a 2 terabyte drive that was empty and brand new, you would get errors. But Y-Cruncher would run for days without errors. And so I think that's probably errors on the PCIe side, not actually to do with the decompression part of it. And so Steve's theory about, corrosion or some type of contaminant during manufacturing fits pretty good with those type of symptoms. But I also, at the same time, there was also a fair bit of psychosis, even just 4 DIMMs, running 4 DIMMs. If you actually are running 4 DIMMs, 3600 might be all you can actually expect. And that is that's a real thing.
It's a problem with Zen 4 as well. If you fully populate the DIMMs, you really can't run it nearly as fast.
Yeah, this is another bombshell though, because AMD, and I've quadruple clarified this, their max supported 5200. Does that mean that AMD's max supported 5200 has been better than Intel's all along, and AMD has been honest about that, whereas Intel's like 5600 fine print 4000?
Yeah, and if you run it at this speed, fully populated, it might break.
No, Intel. That's the crazy thing about the Intel spec. Yeah. Not fully populated. It's the lower number. Just by virtue of having 2 slots for memory per channel, you have to use the lower number, and that's not how it is on AMD.
Yeah, I don't know how much I really have to say about that, though. I mean, I've seen these double standards for so long. Like Intel's running their CPUs at 100 degrees forever. AMD designs Zen 4 to run at 95. Everyone flips out. I'm like, well, what about Intel's been running laptop chips at 100C forever, and now they are again on desktop. What are you talking about?
Didn't they just bump Arrow Lake to 110C? So it's like,
there's a rumor about that, yeah. Which it's so funny too. And my response is, well, I thought Silicon like breaks down at like 120 or something. Like as long as they're sure it runs at 110, I actually don't care. But I gotta imagine that's going to be a bad look after all this if they do announce that.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's. I really wish Intel should have said something a long time ago, especially if they had some idea of what it was, and if they had any inkling of, oh, this is a contamination thing, then they probably should say that. Now, interestingly, one of the 13900s that I had mailed to me from halfway around the world has died. And it died in my care, and it was kind of working, sort of. And this was on the fully updated microcode 125, and its date code is just outside the date code window, or the date code, the dates that Steve indicated in his video for possible contamination. And so, is that just an ordinary CPU death? Like statistically, those happen too. So it's just like, I just have morbid curiosity. Like I just want the stats on this.
Well, let's do that though. Like what you can say. Chris Rich writes in, and he says, for the Raptor Lake issues, whether 13th gen or 14th gen, I think a good starting point would be, what can we take as fact, or at least has overwhelming evidence to basically be fact? For example, I believe, if I'm not wrong, that we can take as fact that Raptor Lake desktops are far more likely to have errors in games than any other models. But what about Raptor Lake laptops? Is there similar evidence that they are also far more likely to have errors than any other models from previous gens? Is it just gaming, or have other software developers experienced similar issues? Has there been any recent failure data that didn't show a Raptor Lake anomaly? Can we be certain that the silicon is degrading, or are we actually not even certain of that yet?
We can't be certain that the silicon is actually degrading, but I think there's a preponderance of evidence that supports that. There is a huge amount of data that I have access to in game crash telemetry for laptops. And keep in mind that like 13900H, technically that is a desktop die. So if desktops are affected, then you would expect, if it's a contamination issue, like you would expect that to be a thing. But there's so much noise in the game crash database. Like laptops that are gaming laptops crash a lot. And so it's very hard to look at that and say, okay, yes, here is this cohort of errors, here's this other cohort of errors. You do get the OODLE error. You do get a lot of other errors, though. I mean, the 9750H was generating lots of OODLE errors in the database that I had, which is another gaming laptop. But is that because the laptop is aging? Is it because of thermal paste? Is it because somebody's turned on gaming mode, which, runs an overclock, which is fine most of the time until it isn't? That's kind of the promise of XMP, is that it's not 24/7 stable, but if you get one crash every couple of weeks, you'd hardly know. I mean, that's another detail that a lot of people missed when I was talking about those CPUs in the context of servers. It's like, for the tests that I'm running, some of these CPUs that I say are not good, it's like, that's what I mean by the half of the half. So like half of these that have an error, half of them are fine. They don't care. But the other half, I could, like, if I was using half of that half in a desktop computer scenario, I'd probably never notice that those CPUs have an error every now and then, because it's like 1 or 2 errors in like 168-hour torture test. And so that probably equates to like a full month of normal desktop usage. And it's just normal desktop usage, a Chrome tab crash or an application crash or Windows does something weird or get a kernel oops, in Linux. That's probably normal, right? Whereas something that's running 24/7 is like, I don't really want that. And so there's a lot of that kind of data in with the laptops. And so it's really hard to say with any certainty that the gaming laptops are worse or better than the other models of gaming laptops available, in the way that, you get the Warframe chart and it's like, yeah, clearly something's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have to highlight this though. Like, you, in your research, you had these, gaming server CPUs that were running below 150 watts. Yes, they're running like 24/7 much more often than a desktop would. And I guess it is just a fact. Technically, CPUs degrade, even if we all have some system around that's 10 years old, doesn't seem to have any issues. But when I see them degrading in 6 months at under 150 watts, even if it's 24/7, to me, that just suggests that they are all probably eventually going to break, though, right? Or was it just with that too, only half of them did? Because
if
they
on
were
the
at
order
300,
of like half.
Right. And so I have this weird theory that and I wonder what you think about this. Someone who's like a CPU architect, doesn't work at like Intel or AMD anymore, but who is kind of seeing where things could fail, and then they needed to do a stepping, like had this suggestion that there were a lot of mitigations put in place in Alder Lake after, Comet and Raptor Lake, and Rocket Lake, because of all of, Spectre meltdown and just the endless little insecurity problems there. And that when they went, though, from Alder Lake to Raptor Lake, that is when they changed the cache. And they did it in record time. Like, I knew about Panther Lake from people at Intel before I knew about Raptor Lake. Raptor Lake, I think, was we got to do something to compete with Zen 4. And in record time, they threw this stuff together, which is just double the E-cores, I don't know, add more cache. And the theory this person proposed is something with like E-cores accessing cache, that they quickly kind of just doubled everything, and something in that not getting enough validation and breaking over time. I wonder what you think about something like that. And so, is that linked to, like, I've heard people say, I'm not an expert at all, but like disabling E-cores can sometimes fix them too.
I expected disabling E-cores when I started to make a difference, but it didn't. Mm-hmm. Mostly. There's a couple exceptions to that, but mostly it didn't make a difference. The biggest difference by far, memory clocks. Lowering the memory clocks sometimes to a glacial 3600. And the second biggest impact was limiting the multiplier to like 53 or 54. The CPU that I murdered may have died because it was exposed to voltages over 1.5 volts, because I was limiting the memory speed only and not the boosts with an AIO cooler. And I left it running a torture test, and I came back, and now it's 0-0 post and doesn't do anything. Anecdotally, on an older BIOS, on a gaming motherboard, not a server board, on a gaming motherboard, leaving the system on the BIOS screen overnight seems to have degraded the CPU. And in the BIOS screen, it looks like it's about 1.6 volts. I'm going to try to replicate that. Don't quote me on that. Maybe it's just coincidence. Again, it's another sample size of 1. But it's also true that these i9 parts tend to require higher voltages for boosts, where the i7s don't. And the i7, the rate of errors for the i7 13th and 14th gen and the i5 is much lower. It's not 0, but it's much lower. It's like the i7 9750H. It's like, it's in there a little bit. It's not 0, but it's lower.
Yeah, and another theory that I saw that's, I think, circulating in the past 48 hours. Well, actually, there's a couple. There's one where someone on Twitter was claiming that like Intel's own validation testing showed that they met JEDEC standards, or whatever it was, or something, and that they haven't found any issues in their full validation, runs. But if that's true, what that would tell me isn't that everyone else is wrong and we just made this all up. What that would tell me is something about the way they're testing just isn't enough to capture this failure. And I would wonder too if, like, when Raptor Lake was thrown together, they had something on the edges of safe. Like, this is something when I was in the automotive industry, all the time we would deal with, where we're within spec if we loosen the tolerances this much. Technically, we're within spec, but we also do still think it will break, because of this confluence of factors in this specific way this part will be used in the car, right? And even if we meet spec, we should still probably up the safety factor because we believe that the requirements just aren't going to capture this failure mode. Do you think there could be anything like that where they really just needed to hit 6 gigahertz to beat Zen 4, and that there was like, well, as long as we're within what we have to be within, just get us there?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an element of that, but also in a lot of the earlier messaging, just in terms of support, like I'm not thinking about this from an end user standpoint. I'm thinking about this from a customer standpoint. It's like, oh, you're using it wrong, and it's like, well, I bought these boards, so I don't. We didn't buy the gamer boards. We bought the non-gamer boards. Like, does Intel have a responsibility to monitor how their partners are using their products, or evaluate them, or say, hey, you're operating a little bit outside of spec?
I would say it would behoove them to do that.
It definitely seems like, it's like, is Intel going to get, the egg on their face? Certainly they were pointing the finger at motherboard partners, and maybe half of the CPUs don't care. Maybe half of the CPUs that are fine today will eventually not be fine. But having been working on this for months, it does seem like there have been a few CPUs that were previously okay, but have become not okay. But I don't really have a huge volume of CPUs to experiment on, because once it's okay, here is the standard operating procedure for getting the system stable, then the army of computer janitors that are actually on the floor are making those changes to the system, and it's like, yes, you're going to get 54, and you're going to get 5600 or 5000 or 4400 or whatever for the memory clocks, and that's it. That's like, if you want to do something on your own, that's fine, but when it crashes, we're not going to give you a credit on the SLA. Like, this is what you get, and that seems like a reasonable way to handle it. And then it just becomes what is the failure rate there? And since like March or April, it's a very small amount of time, things have been very stable, and not a lot of broken stuff has been added to the population of stuff that's questionable, which is great.
All Jessie wants is for Maurice to play with her more often. But unfortunately, he just does not give out playtime or kisses for as low of a rate as she does. And I think she's just going to have to deal with that. But do you know what you don't have to deal with? Paying too much for Microsoft software if you go to CDkeyoffer.com. This piece of content is sponsored by CDkeyoffer.com and their back to school sale. Whether it's Microsoft operating systems, Office products, or even many of the latest games, CDkeyoffer.com provides PC gamers with a product this community deserves. Amongst endlessly elevating component costs, fair pricing on Microsoft keys is one thing that we at least should get, I think. And the Moore's Law is Dead team has been working with CDkeyoffer.com for a very long time. And that's because they're good to me, good to Dan, good to about a dozen family members of friends of mine that have used their services. And they've been really, really good, most importantly, to the Moore's Law is Dead community. So support this channel by using offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% off Microsoft software, or you can also use Die Shrink to save 3% off everything else on the website like games. Using either of those codes really helps the channel a ton, and it helps save you money. So use those codes BrokenSilicon and Die Shrink at CDkeyoffer.com today. Chris Risk writes in, and he says, for consumers and businesses with Raptor Lake systems, whether it's desktop, laptop, or server, that haven't had any issues yet, what actions would you recommend they take now? For those who BIOS. Okay, so update the BIOS. He says, what is there anything like, especially if there's like a gamer with a gaming system, what would you tell them to do right now to make sure their CPU is less likely to break?
Update the BIOS, and it may be worth running Hardware Info 64 and watching the voltage column as you do stuff. Single thread, lightly threaded stuff to get an idea of what voltages are sent to your CPU. It clouds the issue a lot because the voltage that's reported by Hardware Info 64 could come from, I guess, die sense, or it could come from something on the motherboard. And so it's not always an apples to apples comparison, but it may be that, values over 1.5 volts are problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know. I'm just, armchair rando saying that. I can tell you
You can set a max voltage in the BIOS, though, right? Because actually, it sounds like a dumb question, but I don't remember ever doing that when I've overclocked. You just say plus extra voltage, or you cap power or temperature, or you can set a fixed voltage, but can you just cap the top voltage? I don't know.
You can set parameters, like, so load line factors into that.
Okay.
I've got a 13700T that some armchair people have been badgering me on Twitter about because they don't understand. But the 13700T is perfectly stable with a load line of about 1.1 mega ohm, and your AC and your DC load line should match to be inside Intel spec. But it's unstable at some of the default, like, Intel standard, because it can vary from board to board.
Right.
But it's unstable on some boards that have higher load line values by default for, like, the Intel default recommended specs, which is interesting. And if you look at Hardware Info 64 and you look at what voltages it says, they're different, but that's not necessarily indicative of anything, because the voltage sense can come from different places depending on which board that you have. And so it's just like, is it reasonable to expect customers to deal with this? I don't think so.
Yeah, because I remember like overclocking Phenom too, and it's like, here's your 5 options. And now when I even look at just like my Zen 3 system, there's like 20 forms of voltage. And I remember when I used to do that more, because like I'll overclock for like a month and then I'm done for years. I did it. I got to the performance I wanted. But it'll be like, remember, this adds to it, this adds to it, this adds to it. So if you overclock these two ones too much, the total voltage sent to the CPU will be way higher. And that's something you have to watch out for. Like, coming up with a guide for a normie trying to juggle all that, that's almost impossible.
I almost think this whole line of reasoning is a little bit of a straw man, because for the kinds of stuff that I do, none of this matters, because mostly you want to set up the machine and you don't want to think about it. And, actually with some of these deployments, their tech people are really good. It's all automated. Like nobody touches this manually at all, even the BIOS stuff manually. And it gets set to the sensible defaults that are within Intel spec, the Intel published specifications, as much as they are. But Intel's a little loosey-goosey with what they publish, and some of the specifications also depend on the board, because, like, I've been told that for this particular processor, if you have 1.7 mega ohms for the load line, the AC and the DC load line calibration, it's in spec, but that should only be used when the motherboard maker is acknowledging that the motherboard quality is absolute trash tier. And I've seen it on boards that I would not have otherwise said is absolute trash tier. And so it's like, ooh, am I learning? I'm glad to learn. I'm glad to learn new stuff and see how it all fits together. But yeah, it's like, does it make sense for me to waste a bunch of time going down that rabbit hole, when it's just like, okay, if I move the faulty chip from here over to here, like, it's still within, both of these are within spec. One of them is different. One of these things is not like the other. And there's nothing wrong with the board, because another board of the same, like, exact identical configuration. And so, like, do we expect people to, like, play roulette? The other thing too is the other thing that makes me think this whole line of reasoning is a little bit of a red herring, is because there are large OEMs involved, like Lenovo and Dell and HP. And you have them looking at things like Dell with their Alienware line saying, WTF. You've got like 4 options in the BIOS.
Yeah. Right. And how many people are just using these boards that don't give you any options anyways? So, like, how many people are we really helping? PC Dog writes in, he says, hey, Wendell, after your research on Intel's recent CPU failures, will you hesitate to recommend Intel anymore right now, or maybe in the future?
Theoretically, Steve's lead's pretty good, and theoretically Steve's date window is closed. I don't know. The uncertainty is what bothers me. I think that AMD handled their exploding socket drama a little better than Intel has so far. I don't understand why. You remember the Intel OC warranty? It was like $50. We'll give you a one-time mulligans. I don't understand why they don't just do that, because that would be the easy button thing to do. That was amazing. It's like, oh, you got a dead CPU and it's 3 years since you bought it. Just give us $50 and you get a new one. Like, no questions asked.
Well, so a problem though that I've heard, and I started hearing about this really actually late last year, is some retailers who are telling me, and system integrators, someone returns their PC, their i9 broke, and then they send it in for RMA. And he was telling me that it was taking weeks to get them back. And then now I'm told it's often months, not always, but more and more often, it's taking a very long time to be able to get an RMA chip back. And see, that's my problem with that being the solution for Intel.
That'd be the problem, yeah.
I don't know that they have enough to RMA them, and their earnings are already not looking good. These are already being sold for really low margins. I don't know if they can afford to do like Xbox 360 RMAs,
Yeah, they've got insurance. I mean, worst case scenario, I think the cost is immaterial. The supply chain breaking down is more interesting, because that suggests that maybe there is actually something to the thing to look for in the audience is, if you work at one of these major places, did you have an inventory recall? It's a real easy thing to figure out. If you had an inventory recall, then something's wrong with the inventory. If you didn't have an inventory recall, then nothing's wrong with the inventory. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. And so, like, if all of a sudden the inventory disappears, then yeah, that sounds like something is not. It's not motherboard / skill issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It's something you can dig into and ask. And there's probably people in your audience, even just people that are in the supply chain part of it. And it's like, oh yeah, we did have to return the inventory that we had on hand. I reached out to some of my contacts and they said, no, we didn't. We have not had to do an inventory return. But that's a very small sample size, and a very small. You would need somebody larger in the supply chain to figure that out. So,
Nils writes in and he says, "What do you think of the Raptor Lake issues possibly being carried into Meteor Lake and Lunar Lake? Did Intel have the time to root cause the issues and eliminate it, or do you think we might expect stability issues for another few generations?" I'd be surprised if it was in Lunar Lake, but Meteor Lake's a good question.
Lunar Lake is TSMC,
right?
Meteor Lake is, I kind of doubt it, because it's already kind of conservative. That would seem, I suspect that's unlikely. I have a contact I could probably ask about that, but I have no idea. Hadn't even thought about that really before I saw your question when you sent it over. It's a good question. It's probably fine.
What about Emerald Rapids? That uses 10 nanometer, I believe, doesn't it?
Yeah, that might be a little bit of a problem. We'll know. Now, keep in mind that the Emerald Rapids servers tend to be even more conservative, and I need to look at the stack, because not all CPUs in the family are done on the same fab process. At least that's how it was with Sapphire, right? Because there were some CPUs that were Sapphire Rapids, but they weren't all of the bells and whistles of the Sapphire Rapids process.
Yeah, there was the smaller monolithic one that removed some of the accelerators and was a more traditional HDD, well, not HDT, workstation type chip, up to, I think it was 36 cores, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, so I have a 56 core and a 24 core Sapphire Rapids that have been running 24/7 with an overclock, and they are not showing any signs of slowing down or having any degradation. And I'm doing stuff on those machines basically every day.
But remember, that's Golden Cove. Sapphire Rapids,
yeah, that's true,
would use Golden Cove. And so that's where I would really worry about this issue blowing up to a degree that I don't know if Intel could even handle it, is if eventually we see a lot of laptops start failing, and not just the 24 core laptops. Those are just basically desktop chips, but like the 6+8 ones, because if those start breaking, probably Meteor Lake's not affected, but it is pretty much the same architecture. It is on a different node though too. But then Emerald Rapids, if that entire server generation needed to be recalled. That would be, well, a lot of their consumer products do. I don't know. That sounds like a pretty doomsday-ish scenario to me. I think we have to talk about it a little. Like that, could that happen? Because it seems like it's plausible.
I have a little bit of data on newer generation Xeons and failure rates and blah blah blah, but the large customers would be in a better position to run the numbers on that and figure that out. Most of the data that I have is around, like reliability. It's like the rate of ECC correcteds per unit of memory per time, and I've thought about trying to slice and dice some of that data. I actually had a longer term plan to slice and dice some of that data by channels and CPU sockets. So how likely are you to encounter an ECC error? Mm-hmm. And in early data, I've been surprised that some of that you can actually group it by CPU type and socket. So depending on one socket or one CPU type or the other, even accounting for all of the RAM being the same, or at least the same vendor, not always the same part number, but close, that the error rates can follow a socket, which is interesting. It suggests the product or can follow a product in the socket, which is interesting, I think. And those are corrected errors, and so those are well, there's uncorrected errors in there too, but corrected errors are far more prevalent in the data than uncorrected errors. If that is a concern, we will probably find out pretty quickly.
No, I entirely agree. I think, and because again, there were rumblings last year about this. Then you started seeing a little harder to get RMAs, retailers, system integrators complaining. Then now we hear about game devs, and now people are starting to talk about laptop chips. So, I guess we'll see it. It kind of sounds like what you're saying is, look, if we'll know soon, in 2 months, if there's mass laptop failures, that probably means Emerald Rapids has an issue. Right? Like, because if they can, then of course that might.
But keep in mind, those chips are running way more conservatively in terms of watts, clocks, and everything else. And so Intel has exceptionally good failure modeling and failure analysis. And so if this turns out to be something like that, it is almost certainly a black swan type event. And the fact that it hasn't happened, or between 13th and 14th gen, or it's taken them so long to find, or blah, 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 it's probably not washed out in the internal testing that they're doing with this kind of stuff. And it's also true, I think, that the server motherboards are built a lot more conservatively. So it may be that those chips absolutely do have those issues, but it's immaterial. It doesn't matter. It's just that nobody's going to have one of those systems in 20 years in their collection that's still functional, but who cares?
Anonymous server engineer writes in and says, I've seen reports of 7950X shortages, and usually websites just chalk it up to crypto mining, but I know I saw you mention that game server providers are buying up 7950Xs due to failing 13 and 14th Gen i9s. This is very much my experience from what I'm seeing right now as well, and reminds me of the previous Spectre meltdown situation. Anyways, at least in the enterprise I work for, the validation time is around 6 to 12 months, and thus we would, I hope at least, definitely catch this failure. But I have to admit, we wouldn't have caught something like this if it happened in an AMD processor during Spectre, when we were frantically just buying things up and kind of skirting on the testing. What types of changes to server lifecycle management processes will these data center providers probably do to ensure that these new risks get captured, while still ensuring proper level of ROI for the equipment on to go forward?
So the changes that I see happening in the industry really is trying to make the equipment a little bit more heterogeneous, in that we're not going to bet the farm on even one family of CPU or class of CPU. 7950X, I would say that some of the 7950X shortage, may be crypto mining related, but maybe also don't forget that AMD was ramping up for Epic launch. And so, like, this was the thing that I was beating the drum for this a year ago, because down here in pleb tier land where I am, there is a huge amount of demand for like a 16 core CPU gets it done. It's like, I know that AMD and everybody else is really concerned with like the edge compute, and they have, the socket for edge computation, but you can get a lot done with like an 8 or a 12 or a 16 core machine that you'd basically just turn into an appliance. And so they were launching EPYC for AM5. And at Computex 2024, there were tons of systems that were based around AM5 in a server context. Whereas in 2023, my Computex coverage, a lot of it, well, not a lot of it, but a decent amount of it was me running around saying, where is the server AM5 just launched in 2023? Where are my AM5 server motherboards, my server appliances, my low power, my out of band management? I mean, ASRock had theirs, but basically nobody else did. And now in Computex 2024, we have all these specialty systems, cloud gaming systems, telecommunications systems that have oddball PCIe slot configurations, finally, for people that are going to do things like VPN routers or other types of communications appliances. And all these little specialty niche and industrial use cases, we finally have AM5 systems for those. So the 7950X shortage may have been AMD rebadging or pulling that inventory to deploy as EPYC CPUs, because there was plenty of 7950X 3D, and the prices actually came down on all that, which is interesting. So it may have been that, and it could have also been exacerbated by people buying a lot of 7950Xs, because there were a lot of sales of 7950Xs in that context.
That's true. Yeah, it's $700. Obviously, at launch, it was the strongest processor. A lot of people wanted it for like a workstation use, but once you see it at like $450, it's like, oh, hey, maybe I've actually been telling people on my channel for like 6 months now, like, hey, you can wait for Zen 5 if you want the best, or you don't need to buy something now. Don't make yourself buy something you don't really need. But I mean, you could get a 7950X for $200 less than they're going to sell, or even the 7950X 3D for like $100 less than they're going to end up selling the 9950X. I mean, why not just buy now? Especially if you're like Micro Center, they'll give you like RAM for free half the time. You're not doing better than that, unless you just want only the absolute best and newest. Then I guess you can wait. But for everyone else, unless you're going for that very top, you're not beating like a $300 7800X 3D. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, and so that could propel those sales because they're just at the price people wanted.
Yeah. And I really think that most people don't realize how awesome it is having that much horsepower at your disposal to do, when we're talking about a system that needs to last 3 years or 5 years or beyond. It's like, I need something that's going to feel like it's fast for 5 years. It's like, well, it's probably do pretty good.
Reginald Ari and Gian Violi write in together and say, considering the current Intel issues, how likely is it that OEMs might switch, or I guess more rapidly switch, to AMD processors in the near future? Basically, do you think this is a market share shifting event? How much impact do you guys think the current Intel situation will have on AMD's play for laptop market share?
It's really hard to say. I mean, Intel's still got a ton of volume. It certainly doesn't hurt AMD, and depending on how Intel handles it publicly and privately, is probably going to have a pretty big effect on those kinds of things. I think it can only be a good thing for AMD, no matter how you cut the cheese. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of coverage and there's a lot of hype, but it still doesn't seem to me to rise to the level of like catastrophic 4-alarm, everything is like pants on fire, broken, Intel forgot how to make CPUs. I don't think it's that bad. And I think that the fact that there definitely is something to that only the highest end CPUs are affected.
So far, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, was that an Icarus situation? It's like, careful, Icarus, and then flown too close to the sun, or
is it just the A+16 die that specifically has this fault or something?
Yeah, because if you got all these laptops that start dying when they're 3.5 years old, I don't think anyone's going to care.
Right.
Even though it's, a lot of people do get 4 or 5 years out of their laptop, but it's like, oh, it started to get flakier. It's so unusably flaky. I mean, a lot of the time that's just the thermal paste. The thermal paste has pumped out, or the thermal paste has stopped being, viable. And so Intel has gotten lucky like that in the past when there have been this kind of defect. I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that like the Spectre meltdown thing was definitely a market shifting event, though. I know AMD was already taking market share with Epic because it was infinitely better than their bulldozer stuff. But at the same time, I hear so many server people I talk to purchasing who are just like, oh, yeah, AMD looks good. Oh, look, they have 32 cores. Oh, look, they have 64 cores. Yeah, maybe we'll give Zen 3 or Zen 4 a try. And then when Spectre and Meltdown happened, they said, oh, maybe we'll give it a try right now. We can't know what would have happened in another universe where that didn't happen. But I really think that went from like a 45 mile an hour to a 60 mile an hour acceleration. And that's what I would worry about with this, where they're already kind of flirting with AMD, more at AMD Advantage laptops with Strix than ever before. And then they go, these ones don't work. All right, give us more of them. In fact, I almost heard that happen a little with Meteor Lake, where Meteor Lake came out like 3 months later than they wanted. And all of a sudden Phoenix just started showing up and everything because they needed something to put in their holiday laptops that was new.
Yeah. I think I would probably think like thinking about that a little bit more. I think that the opportunity here is going to be, does Lunar Lake deliver on amazing battery life? And if no, then does Zen 5? And if Zen 5 does, then Zen 5 is going to be even more ingratiated in these OEMs that are building their laptops and doing everything else. Outside of laptops, the elephant in the room is ARM, and specifically like what Amazon is doing with Graviton. Like Amazon is a large customer. Amazon is able to run more and more workloads on Graviton, and every day Graviton gets more competent. Those Graviton sockets are not coming back. They are not coming back to Intel, and they are not coming back to AMD. They are gone from the market. Obviously, enterprises and Fortune 500s and that kind of thing are looking at that kind of thing. Your everyday typical business probably not looking to make moves that bold. It's like, are they going to deploy an Ampere system to run their pedestrian, containerized workloads? Probably not for a few years. But the commercial wins that Amazon is pulling out by moving to Graviton, their own internal ARM system, that is effectively shrinking the market for x86 sockets, because you got all this insane growth for server stuff, but it's never going to be that. And as Nvidia gets better and better and better with their ARM integration, you realize that Nvidia could do something crazy. We got ARM laptops now. Nvidia, like the obvious move would be for Nvidia to go to Microsoft and say, "Oh yeah, let's do a laptop that's amazing."
Come on, Microsoft Surface, powered by NVIDIA AI. Yeah.
But I think the only thing stopping them is that all of the Microsoft developers are busy trying to prop up Qualcomm or throw them under the bus or whatever. I don't think Microsoft can make up its mind this week. But the ARM is the real threat to x86. And I think that's going to cause both Intel and AMD to get their stuff together so that things like sleep work right, and sleep and suspend and power management and C states and all of that kind of stuff.
I don't know if you saw that. I put out a report about something called AMD Soundwave, which I am told is an ARM APU that they plan to launch, I think it was 26 or 27, which is interesting because it's not immediately. But then again, maybe that's when Windows will actually work on ARM. So maybe that's like the perfect time to launch it, right? I think AMD would be threatened, but there's a part of me that goes, I think this is their test case to just see if they can hit it out of the park. And if Soundwave is competent, they'll go, especially to investors, look, we don't care if it's ARM or x86, man. We'll make a CPU. We'll just make CPUs. Whereas I don't see Intel showing, and I don't hear of Intel showing really any interest in making ARM chips right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that socket goes away and they lose their x86 license. There's a lot of reasons that Intel would not like to have an ARM universe. I really hope there's a Skunkworks team, like 12 people. AMD probably doesn't have the spare manpower bandwidth, but if there was like a Skunkworks team, like a young Jim Keller and a young,
no, there was a younger Jim Keller working on, what was it, K12? He was working on a Skunkworks ARM project.
Yeah.
Which I don't know what happened to that. I've recently been told by people that like maybe it wasn't killed, it just was paused, and now that Qualcomm's entering the space, I think there are skunkworks people working on ARM stuff at AMD right now. Actually, I really do, especially because I know they bid for the Nintendo Switch 2 and lost to Nvidia. You would have to imagine they were looking at an ARM APU for that as well if they were bidding for that contract.
Yeah. There's definitely more opportunity than there has ever been for that kind of thing. A lot of people are climbing the walls for Linux to run on the new Snapdragon processors as well, and they'll get that running, and then there will be an amazing ARM Linux experience, and that might really blow open the doors, because once you get the Linux people looking at how that stuff really works, then problems really start getting fixed on the hardware side.
Yeah.
And we might end up with an amazing ARM laptop experience, and then from that comes a whole bunch of other stuff. And so it may just be a natural transition. It's like you got some x86 cores and you got some ARM cores and some sort of mutant.
I could see that too, like on the IO die, like a quad core ARM for running native things efficiently, power, like when you're not using the power cores really a lot, but then they activate x86 P cores. I could totally see that be someone trying that at some point. I don't hear anyone is right now, but it certainly would be an interesting idea.
All the system architecture guys in the audience are all just like, nope, never happened. It's too complicated.
I know. And the second those words left my mouth, I'm sure they're like, can you not make me miss my kid's birthday? I mean, trying to make that working. God, we already gave up on 4-way hyperthreading. Now that it's warming up outside, Jessie couldn't be happier to be jumping around every day in the warmer weather. And it's good for me too. Running around with her, teaching her tricks, that's good for my health as well, not just hers. But all of this gallivanting, well, it takes up time and it pressures me to make my lunches quicker to get moving faster with Jessie every weekend afternoon. And usually quick means less healthy. Well, unless you know about Vite Ramen. This piece of content is brought to you by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers a ton of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy to add protein and other ingredients of your choice, and then also their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break away from home. And I do need to take a second also to remind everyone that they don't just make ramen. They also have Nano Boost Vitality Powder that I honestly think blows away the health powder competition. I literally drink this any night a broken silicon is recorded extra late instead of coffee. And they also have a collection of silverware and accessories that are always high quality. Like the Goofy Girl DM Nakiri knife, I tried it out. It is insanely sharp. It is probably the nicest knife this household owns. So not just the ramen, although the ramen's great. Everything else on there is high quality, and that's why I've been working with Vite Ramen for so long. I actually like their products, all of their products, a lot. I've never tried something they made that wasn't good, so check them out. And remember that even just clicking on the link in the description helps the channel a ton, and buying some of the special packs through that link helps you save money and support the channel even more. So support Moore's Law Z by checking out Vite Ramen today. Let me see here. But let's talk about Strix, because I know today you just put out a interview with someone at AMD about Strix, and I'm really curious what your thoughts are on it, because I watched it right before we started recording. I mean, it was really interesting. Like they said, most of the time you'll probably actually be using the Zen 5C cores, so we will be using the lower power cores, which still have the full IPC and whatever, so it should be snappy. And then they have modular power states. They were talking about how they were almost quite literally putting a lot of the APU into sleep mode without actually going into sleep mode. And I specifically love the focus on mixed use battery life. Like he said, we don't just want to give you a 16-hour battery life. We want to give you a 16-hour battery life where like 8 of those hours we're running intensive apps and teams at the same time. And this focus I've seen of like, at idle, it can last 20 hours. But if you do anything, it lasts 5 hours. I just want consistency. And it seems like that's a major focus of Strix, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm hoping that. So I want to go hands-on. I haven't gone hands-on with Lunar Lake, and I haven't gone hands-on with Strix either. But I love that was an interview with Mahesh Supermoney, and he is a really sharp guy. I love talking to him, and I love the way that he thinks, because he's usually a couple of steps ahead of me in terms of this is what I'm interested in, and this is how everything fits together. But in working on the 7000 series CPU on my framework laptop, there's the Pop! OS folks also working on AMD CPUs have come up with their own way of dealing with sleep and low power states. And Linux has Power Top and a bunch of really good telemetry for helping you find which applications are doing what. And the approach from a typical Linux distro and what Framework recommends is also a little different. So there's two like completely opposite ends of the spectrum options for doing power management, and they arrive at very similar real world results. But if I reach in and I tune all of the knobs and I make everything run as power efficiently as possible, including turning down my NVMe to PCIe Gen 3 and blah, 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 I can't, and I got to take out the DGPU. I ordered my framework with a DGPU. I shouldn't have done that because it takes a lot of power. It is nice to have a DGPU though. It's fun.
Well, anyway, you can just slap it in and out of the framework, can't you? Or do you have to open it up completely?
Yeah, not easily.
Oh no, not easily. Okay.
And so I can get approaching 12 hours of usage out of that thing, which is incredible. Now, there's cores that never wake up under any scenario, but for coding and checking email and doing that kind of stuff, that's amazing. But you're never going to get that battery life from Windows, not in a million years. And it is possible that AMD is laying the groundwork with the Zen 5 SoC to be able to do those kinds of things in an x86 experience. It is still not the case. I don't know about Zen 5, but up till now, it's still not the case that like just a basic, like a Mac-like experience where you close the lid and it's asleep, and you open the lid 2 days later and the battery has gone down 1%. Like that. Like, why is that so hard?
Well, what's your experience with that, though, with your Hawkpoint Minis Forum tablet? Because I've recently noticed, because I use it to read in bed at night, so half the time I fall asleep with it just in my hand. And then when I turn it on in the morning, unlike with my prior laptops, I have noticed the battery is still there. Now, it maybe went down 5% or 1% in like 8 hours instead of 1% over an entire day. But I have noticed a massive improvement in that one over my previous laptop. So I wonder if you have.
Yes, it is. It is very, very good there. So in my video about ARM, that's what I used for the comparison. And if you are lightly loaded, the power performance of that CPU in that tablet is comparable to the Snapdragon. Now, if at very low power, the Snapdragon beats the crap out of it, and under full load, the Snapdragon does okay, slightly better. But if you just have like 2 or 3 threads busy, like a background hum, if you're using like one of the PC Mark tests that simulates not a heavily loaded system, but like you're just doing office stuff, the power usage is almost identical between the $1,000 Surface Snapdragon laptop and that, which to me is like...
Especially because this is a company that's like really small and just threw this together to see if they could do it.
Yeah. So it's just like, it makes me think, it's like, what is going on with the AMD reference designs? And I always ask AMD, and they're very tight-lipped about. It's like, do you got a reference design that you shared with your partners? That they're like, yes, it uses lots of high-end components and it lasts forever. And I was like, did anybody implement that? No.
Yeah. I mean, I found that too. That's what I said in my review for the tablet as well. Is like, it doesn't really have a stellar maximum battery life. It's like 8 to 10 hours. It really isn't any better. And it's really actually a little worse than some 15-inch laptops with bigger batteries. But in terms of like using it, like when I'm putting a video or a podcast together on an airplane, which is very nice to have something that small, like at 40 to 80% usage, it will last for like 4 or 5 hours. And now that doesn't sound impressive, but can tell you what, my old Comet Lake laptop, if I left it sitting, it could last 11 hours. If I used it to prepare a podcast, it would last like 2 hours. There's like, and that difference in actual real world usage, it'll be interesting because it's a little harder to market because everyone likes to just say 20 hours, peak, blah, 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 1,000 hours of watching Netflix or whatever. But I think people will notice it more if it's mixed usage because that's real usage.
Yeah, if you tweak that so that it never turns the fans on, you'll get an extra 45 minutes of battery life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. So I guess what is your overall impression of Strix versus Lunar Lake competitiveness, though? We've heard a lot of interesting stuff in that interview and obviously in the slides AMD's put out a week ago. But like, do you get the impression that it's going to match Lunar Lake's efficiency? And I think this is a good question because I know the Fox, who has a YouTube channel, he tracked everything they were doing with the Lunar Lake system on the floor and then wrote it all down and then got as close to an identical Hawkpoint system as he could. And at least in gaming, he seemed to indicate they just kind of have the same performance, actually, Hawkpoint and Lunar Lake in terms of battery life. Well, gaming and idle, who knows? But
yeah, it does look really close. There is a ton of stuff in Lunar Lake that makes me think that Intel really has pulled out all the stops in order to be as efficient as possible. I was also extremely impressed with Intel's efficiency on Xeon 6. Like Xeon 6, what they're able to accomplish in 250 watts per socket, I never would have thought Intel would be capable of that level of efficiency, having experienced, gestures to all of the other stuff. But Xeon 6 is really, really good. And now the P cores and the E cores are completely redesigned in Lunar Lake. And so it looks like the E cores are going to be a significant performance increase. And if they're able to do that in that same power envelope that we see in Xeon 6, in terms of just because the Xeon 6 E cores are like how they've tuned that is something. And those are not the new E cores, those are the old ones. Mm-hmm. And so like if they have the new E cores that are even more beyond that, that's what I'm basing that on. And so I think that is going to be some really interesting opportunities for Intel in terms of power efficiency and battery life and all-day compute and so on and so forth. That said, the Lunar Lake dev machines seem to have 120 watt power bricks. So we'll see.
Yeah.
I need hands-on with both of these systems. I've never been really super excited about mobile, and the System 76 laptop, which is behind me, the one that I added Thunderbolt to and murdered, was when I really started to notice AMD power efficiency. And then things improved incrementally from 6 to 7,000, and I got all the bugs worked out with USB 4. And now USB 4, it's like, and Zen 5 and the small Zen 5 cores, and it looks like several different threads AMD is tying together. And so there's a lot to be excited about there, I think.
Yeah, I think with Lunar Lake, one thing that I liked is they, I think it was just, frankly, it was a mistake in Meteor Lake to have these low power E-cores on a separate tile that can't really be used in a snappy way because they're at like 1 gigahertz. I mean, if the idea is you don't want to use the other cores unless you need to save battery life, why on earth are the low power cores so weak you wouldn't want to use them anyways? It seems like with Lunar Lake, where they're kind of as strong as a Raptor Lake core, you'd go, oh, well, that is probably not an issue to just use those 4. And I think that alone is probably going to be a huge driver of longer battery lives than Meteor Lake got. This is a random question. I didn't actually plan it ahead of time, but what do you think about, like, I've heard, and I think it's been rumored for a while now, that Panther Lake is going back to LPE cores. So like not just LPE and P cores like we're going to see with Lunar Lake, but the Panther Lake is going to go back to this idea supposedly of separated LPE cores away on another tile. Like, do you think that's still something worth going for? Or I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
It depends on how they put it together. So if the cores are all really far away, then it just makes it more expensive to put those cores to sleep and to wake them up. Mm-hmm. And so on mobile, you would never want to wake them up. Or if you did wake them up, it's only because you've already been running some other job for several seconds. So when you start something and then the computer hitches or it hiccups for 100 milliseconds or whatever while it's moving all of that from one core complex to another core complex, is that a viable strategy for dealing with that? Like, does that make sense? Or is this one of those things for like a business laptop? The business laptop, when it's plugged in, is going to feel like a different machine than when it's not on battery. I think that as a trend, the world is going toward, it's not going to perform different on battery versus the wall. It's basically going to be the same.
And like the Minis 4 and V3 does. I'm never going back to anything else. I mean, now that I know what it's like to just have the full performance no matter what I'm doing.
Yeah. And so I think that the system designers have to be careful of that, and they have to be cognizant of that, because they'll fall into the trap of, we just won't use those because they eat all the power. And it's like, so that's already a fatal mistake, even before it's, before you've sneezed it out.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what about Zen 5, the architecture in general, like especially as it pertains to desktop? Leading up to the Zen 5 embargo on information being released, I was thinking of Zen 5 as, I always heard it was like mid-teens, maybe low 20s IPC, so better than Zen 4, but certainly not a Zen 3 performance increase. That's what we've basically seen, but it seems like a larger efficiency leap than Zen 4 was. So I kind of see it as like similar to Zen 4 in importance, but like kind of more important for the things it's in. But now that like you're just seeing how many products in 1 month, or at least within a few months, are going to launch with Zen 5, just across all product stacks. And the more I think about like AVX 512 is probably going to make Zen 5 age really well, actually. Like what we're seeing now in the performance ups will probably increase over time. And I think we saw it with Zen 3 over Zen 2 as well. Like, how significant do you see Zen 5, and how would you compare its provenance versus how important Zen 4 or like previous Zens were?
So Zen 2 is the one that surprised me, because, from Zen 1 to Zen 2, it's like, wow, that's a really big leap, and it lays the foundation, blah, blah, blah. And then Zen 3, they got everything, like, Zen 3, whew, nice. But Zen 2 stuck around forever. Zen 2 in the Steam Deck. Look, it's still killing it in the Steam Deck today. Just plucky little Zen 2. And so I think Zen 5 is another Zen 2 where they lay the groundwork for everything. And what comes after Zen 5 is probably going to be jaw-dropping. But Zen 5 really brings a lot of micro-architectural changes that were necessary in order to take advantage of the new stuff that's available. I'm not really sure that some of the problems we were talking about earlier with Intel are not exacerbated by the fact that now it's easy to get insanely fast DDR5 memory, and everybody expects, before people were buying, cheap bargain basement swill memory, and now they get good memory, and the good memory being so fast is why they can't achieve stability, but that wasn't guaranteed in the first place. And so like the availability of all this new hot stuff being from day one with Zen 5 means that Zen 5 is going to be able to take care of all of this new hot stuff. And certainly, AMD has previewed some of those new features on Zen 5 to do with like a better memory controller, and the memory controller can say, oh, you have a DDR5 8000 kit. Let me automatically compute reasonable timings to use it, not a DDR5 8000, but like as if it was, with similar timings, even though it's not clocked at DDR5 8000 on Infinity Fabric, in order to be able to do ABC XYZ.
Yeah. And, I also think that's kind of changed my mind a little more. I always thought Zen 5 looked good. I wasn't like a hater or anything, but like seeing that they've managed to get seemingly some sort of like 20% performance uplift while actually making the cores smaller than Zen 4. I mean, I always thought that they were going to be, I don't know, kind of like Zen 2 to Zen 3, 10, 20% bigger. I guess the cores technically are, but they managed to shrink the cache. Like, that to me is really impressive and really important, because it's going to allow them, and I put out the leak about this. People seem to be hearing similar things out there as well, that I think Zen 5 is going to be really cost competitive in designing this in a way where it's not just good and easy to mass manufacture on a 4 nanometer node, but that it's actually small enough to where you can actually charge less than the previous generation. I think that's going to, again, kind of make it like Zen 2, where it's like, I can't believe what I'm getting for this price. And that's going to make it a really big deal for AMD.
If that's, your earlier question about market share and market share erosion and margins, if AMD chooses to price aggressively, then I think that does open up some options in terms of capturing market share, because that'll put a lot of pressure on Intel in terms of like it's going to eat into their margin a lot, because it looks like the trajectory that they're on means that things are going to be a little more complicated for them in terms of deploying the similar kind of functionality on a desktop socket, in other words, whereas AMD is like, yeah, let's just do this and good to go.
And I kind of hear that, like, Strix Halo, maybe even Kraken, although that I've not heard that for those listening. I'm just speculation by me. But like that they're going to start sharing chiplets with laptop as well, and like getting into this thing where like they're just making probably 2 or 3 CCD types, and then they're just deploying them across. I especially heard this with Zen 6, like Medusa and desktop and like all this stuff, like sharing helps them with time to market even further.
As Dr. Ian Cuttress says, it's picojoules per watt. No, picojoules per bit. There we go. Picojoules per bit. So if you look at the amount of energy required to move 1 bit of energy on like RDNA 3, that is way better than we had previously. And so in order to use these in laptops, you need substrates and interposers where it doesn't cost you a lot of energy to move across. It needs to be on the order of what you would get from a single piece of silicon, or at least not dramatically more, because then immediately you've got heat and you've got power loss and everything else. And so co-packaged makes sense for things like RAM and everything else. But if you go the chiplet route, you have to do it as efficiently as you possibly can from a power standpoint. And so if they're able to figure that out, and it seems like they are well on the trajectory to do that, because they have got 2 different divisions that are interested in the same thing, then yeah, that could work out really well.
Yeah, I mean, and so especially that cost thing, though, like this is like my concern with Intel having all of these issues right now. Like right now, you've got a bunch of people. I guess we don't technically know how bad it is, but we know that people are worried and that there is a problem. And I'm starting to wonder if, like, AMD goes, which I've heard they probably will, like $600 for the 16 core, $450 for the 12, $350 or something for the 8, and maybe even $250 for the 6 core. And they do this at a time when a lot of people, I wonder if they'll convince a lot of Intel Raptor Lake owners with i5s to go, I was going to go from a 12600K to a 14900K. Or what if I just got AMD that costs less right now? And this is like 6 months before Arrow Lake launches, or at least 4. And Arrow Lake's going to come out, but it uses 3 nanometer, which is so much more expensive packaging. If AMD were to charge $600, I mean, especially if it's like $700 for the X3D flagship, I don't know how Intel can price Arrow Lake on 3 nanometer with all those tiles against it.
Yeah, that's a much more articulate version of what I was thinking of in terms of Zen 5 is coming. And if AMD chooses to be aggressive, then market share capture, it's going to be a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Yeah, Arrow Lake's got to be good. But Gian Violi writes, and it says, "Hi, Tom and Wendell. In your opinions, what's the biggest advantage AMD is not leveraging enough right now?"
I would love it if AMD, so like this whole memory speed kerfuffle thing, we're entering a phase where you may be able to get LPCAM motherboards. I would love it if AMD starts pre-binning to say, hey, if you use our chips with LPCAM, you can be guaranteed DDR5 6000 or whatever. And that becomes the new baseline. That would be an incredible move from AMD, because it does look like right now AMD's memory controller has a better baseline than Raptor Lake, which is wild.
Yeah, like they could even have maybe like a 9950 XS, and they're like, this guarantees a higher memory speed support if you want to pay extra for those yields or something.
Well, it's too hard to support on the motherboard side, and I think you take that goes away if you only guarantee it on LPCAM motherboards. Then it's a lot easier for AMD to say, yeah, this is fine, because you never know. It's like the marrying of the motherboard and the socket and the CPU that really gives you your stable DDR5 configurations, and there's a lot of variables that go away with LPCAM.
Yeah. So you're kind of saying, like, in general too, like if it really is the memory, like if it just turns out Intel goes, guess what? Sorry, it's actually DDR5 4000 is what you need to set this to, which actually my Raptor Lake i7 has had trouble with DDR4. And a year ago, I heard about a lot of them having trouble hitting high DDR4 clocks with some of the weaker models. I believe we talked about that. Yeah, maybe that's what it is. It really doesn't have it does have the validation. They just pretend it's actually not the baseline that it really is. that AMD really should be telling people, hey, no, you actually can. That should be part of their marketing. Like, we actually can use this RAM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wild if that's how it's been the whole time. I actually have some documentation. I found some PDFs from Intel that they published where they weren't towing the whole routed versus like 2 DPC is defined as you were using 2 DIMMs per channel, not routed. But a lot of their documentation does say routed, but some of it literally says it's the speed is not affected unless memory is populated. And it's like, well, way to be consistent there, Intel.
All right, I want to ask you this. How do you feel about Radeon? It's fascinating to me, like with all of these Intel issues causing, people to be like worried and about getting Intel. At the same time, AMD is announcing all this crazy stuff with Strix. And then they're like, God, I really wish Radeon could compete the way Ryzen does. And I wonder how you feel about their position in the market right now.
So pretend gaming doesn't exist for a second. I was doing some work on the Radeon, the W7800. And so this is a workstation card. It's 32 gigs of GDDR6. It's a 2-slot card. It's 280 watts roughly. It has 3 DisplayPort 2.1 ports and then a 4th DisplayPort 2.1 port that is 80 gigabit. And so DisplayPort 2.1, we're in a wild situation right now with DisplayPort 2.1 where like all the gaming cards are only the lower standard DisplayPort 2.1. But AMD does actually have a GPU that can do the full fat DisplayPort 2.1, but it uses a mini DisplayPort connector. And the reason it uses a mini DisplayPort connector is because nobody makes a DisplayPort connector that doesn't have reflections and awful radio harmonics when you're sending a full bitrate DisplayPort 2.1 signal down it. And so we've resurrected the horror, the Lovecraftian horror that is the mini DisplayPort connector, which anybody that's actually had to use that it's like bamboo shoots under your fingernails. But the new versions of the mini DisplayPort connector actually work really well across all of the frequencies and all of the other stuff. And so as I was working on this, I discovered that Autodesk and Unreal have shown up with a lot of good support for the ecosystem on RDNA 3. And so if you run Revit or you run Maya or you run Blender or you run some of the other stuff like that, you actually have a really good experience. And the situation has improved pretty dramatically, even over the 6000 series cards. And so I think AMD's problem all along had just been developer bandwidth and getting developers together with customers and having enough customers using Revit and using our other Autodesk products and using these things professionally to just get it done. And having worked on a couple of those commercial application, like knowing some people is like, hey, you want to try this GPU? And they try it. I was like, oh wow. And I was like, oh my gosh, this GPU is only $2,200. This is a really good deal because Nvidia GPUs are basically unobtainium because of the AI craze, and having the GPUs be that good was certainly surprising to some folks that I know that work in the industry, that I was able to like vampire some of their time. And so I think that shows that AMD is serious about the dev ecosystem. And so I use that as kind of a reflection for what's going on the gaming side as well. I know that there were some internal changes at AMD a year or two ago, and it looks like that those changes in the ecosystem have been for the better. And we know that AMD has been sort of acquiring companies with the aim of augmenting their developers on the AI side. And so I think that AMD needs to continue that trajectory of hiring developers, but also keeping them organized and working on this, because hardware has got the goods. My goodness. But the software part was maybe the part that was lacking. And I think that gamers probably intrinsically knew that.
Yeah.
But Radeon and Adrenaline and everything else, like they just CrowdStrike 2 and anti-lag now get along apparently. And so it seems like AMD is moving fast on these things and keeping up with everything on a driver and development side. And so if they're able to continue the momentum and continue accelerating, then I think the sky's the limit. But already I would say that it's already a first-class experience compared to what I experienced even 2 or 3 years ago.
I 100% agree. I'm using actually as my backup desktop that Minis Forum Adaman GT7 parts. Interesting name, and I'm using that 7600M XT as my main GPU. And the editing experience compared to even a year ago is quite noticeable. Like it works really well for like a little 200 millimeter square GPU. And I can't help but think here, like I might want to like retry using a 7900 XTX. I've been using a 4090 for a while, and then 3070 before that. And because I'm starting to realize that it's just slick. The interface is slick. It works. There's no crashes. All of my software finally leverages the GPU correctly. So you don't seem to be very pessimistic about Radeon. I see a lot of people are lately, just because I think they're disappointed. I don't know, and the AMD not going for the high end this year. But I wonder if you would agree that I feel like they've laid the groundwork, though, even if they stumbled a bit with the launch of RDNA 3. The groundwork is there if they just stay consistent and execute on generations.
I agree with that. And also, the architectural changes for RDNA 3.5 look to me to be exactly where AMD should have spent its money. If it was money and time, if it was a choice of RDNA 4 or knock it out of the park with what we need in terms of groundwork for Steam Deck 2.0 or whatever's coming with RDNA 3.5, absolutely RDNA 3.5.
Yeah. Let me see
for
here.
Mobile.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I've seen people say that too. Like, why is there 3.5 and 4? And there's rumors that they'll use 3.5 for a while in APUs. I think it's pretty obvious that RDNA 3.5 is taking the parts of RDNA 4 that you definitely want in laptop. The efficiency increases and but then they're also cutting out a little bit of the RDNA 4 stuff so that they can make it smaller and actually fit on the APU. This piece of content is brought to you by the AOC T8 Plus Mini PC. It is complete with 4 Gracemont cores in its CPU, 24 execution units in the included iGPU, 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5, and a half a terabyte of SSD storage just that comes in the package. And how does it perform? Well, it's reasonably snappy when you're doing standard tasks. It feels like any other modern CPU most of the time, but I will warn that if you're downloading a bunch of games on Steam, maybe installing another one on another launcher, and then working with 20 Chrome tabs open, it can slow down a bit with its quad core. Although I can't say I should complain too much about that, considering the included CPU in this little thing is actually a little stronger than the Ivy Bridge i5 in one of my first gaming desktops. So from that perspective, it's pretty impressive. And it actually surprised me that it can run old games like Max Payne 3 at 60 frames per second with reasonable settings. It can even run a modern game like Age of Empires 4 at minimum settings in a full room at frame rates that are playable. So it can do light gaming quite well. And well, when you consider its price, which is below $200 after coupons, and the fact that this tiny thing can support 3 4K displays, it has built-in Wi-Fi, dual Ethernet, 3 USB 3.1 ports, it's pretty impressive. It can fit in your pocket, it sips energy, so the price, it's really not bad. And if you are interested, please click on the link in the description for the best current price from Moore's Law is Dead fans. Doing so will help me, and will also help you get the best deal if you're interested in the AOC T8 Plus Mini PC. Quick Jumper writes in and says, what do you think overall about RDNA 3 and the innovations it has brought? Most notably, they released a functional chiplet on A0 step, and if I remember correctly, right, there are a lot of people hating RDNA 3 for being A0, to which other people said, well, it's kind of incredible they could launch an A0 stepping. It seems like they spent a lot of money on chiplet design and then realized they should just focus on a cheaper RDNA 4.
I think that it seems to me that the power efficiency that they got out of moving the memory controller into chiplets is going to yield dividends in several aspects of their business going forward. And they might not realize those dividends today, but that was a worthwhile investment.
Right, you were laying the groundwork for like how to do that for tons of future products.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that's a win. I also think that their workstation class cards, which are think of the W7800 basically as the 32 gig version of the 7900 XTX, and the fact that that's that they can charge $2,200 for that. If their software, like think about this, if their software were absolutely a first class experience, and you had all of the video editing stuff that you could count on it 100%, and everything was great, and so on and so forth, would you buy a $1,400 or $1,500 4090 when you could get a 32 gig with 24 gigs of VRAM, when you get a 32 gig VRAM for video editing and everything else, like all things being equal in terms of the software experience, would you spend a couple $100 extra and get a W7800? Think you probably would if you were using it commercially, versus the equivalent, say like an RTX A4000, which is 3,000.
Right.
Well, MSRP is like $30-something $100, but then actual market price is even more.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think about what AMD should do with the RAM and RDNA 4, because by all accounts, it seems like their RDNA 4, like I assume they'll call it the 8800 XT, but I think it'd be better just call it the 8700 XT and stop pretending. I like the 7800 XT. I just still think it should have been called the 7700 XT. But that it'll probably be some like $500 thing on 4 nanometer that's like 300 millimeters squared, maybe smaller even, apparently. 16 gigabytes of RAM, probably 7900 XT performance raster, a little better. Ray tracing apparently wildly better than that. So they're actually trying this time. I wonder what you think about, that being 16 gigabytes, then probably another 16 gigabyte, then maybe another, mostly 16 gigabyte lineup. Do you think they should maybe consider like a, 8800 XTX where it's golden sample yields and they give it 32 gigabytes of RAM? Because from what I'm hearing, it seems like the 5090 is going to have 28 gigabytes of RAM, 32 most. The 5080 is going to have 16 gigabytes again, probably for $1,200, which to me just seems insulting. How many people do you think they could sway in enthusiast gamers and maybe even the semi-professionals if they're like $500 for a 16 gigabyte card that competes with the 5070? But guess what? If you pay $700, you can get a card with more RAM than a 5090 for half the price, or probably a fourth the price of a 5090. Do you think that would sell well? Do you think that would appeal to a lot of people?
Yeah, I think that having the VRAM and being able to do all of the other stuff definitely would, having the use cases there to support the product, definitely. But since they're making inroads with the professional products, like these are good products for professional use cases with professional certified software. They probably don't want to eat into that too much because the pricing there is already super aggressive in a good way. But I don't know how you get the word out that, AMD is basically there for pros. Like AMD's just buddied up to, large architectural firms and large companies that are buying tons of GPUs. Like, listen, just tell us what you want and we'll build it. And so they have, and it's like, oh yeah, we're just going to buy AMD from now on. I mean, AMD is basically taking over the universe of like medical imaging displays, which I just added support for in the KVM firmware. And Barco is one of the companies, and so like AMD's software dev kit is really pretty good. And so here you have AMD basically taking over the universe for medical imaging displays because the SDK and everything else is so easy to use. So they have to continue that software trajectory and have just folks using it like you would use it. It's like, what's your experience with DaVinci Resolve? What's your experience with Premiere? What's your experience? And putting those people in a place to be able to raise issues with Adobe or take action or whatever, that's really the secret to NVIDIA's success, is just having these little teams doing this stuff 7 days a week or 5 days a week. Then yes, people having those good experiences will absolutely buy the bejesus out of those products.
Yeah, and I think that's the question, right? Like it's kind of like a chicken and an egg problem. Like you want everyone to see AMD everywhere and buy up those cards in the professional space. So would it make sense to just bite the bullet and give away at $700, launch a $700 gaming card with 32 gigabytes to build the inroads for the future ones? Or do you want to still just limit that? I don't know. I do. For me, my answer to that question is just depends how close they get to the NVIDIA parts. Like I know they're meant to be mid-range, but if the Navi 48, I believe it is, or if that die manages to compete or even beat the 5070, like let's say they do manage to make this 4 nanometer chip that can be sold for $500 that is around XTX raster and actually wildly beats it in ray tracing. That's the situation where I think you go, so could the overclocked models get kind of close to like a 5070 Ti? Give it 32 gigabytes and launch that for $700 so that it's being priced next to like a 12 or 16 gigabyte NVIDIA card. I'm sorry, that would just sell like hotcakes. And if it's if it's at that level of performance, some games will use more than 24 gigabytes, or 16. Like, why not do it? But if it manages to if it's more like a 7900 GRE with good ray tracing, that's where I go. I don't think you can quite push that into the enthusiast place. But I think there's a lot of people that would upgrade from like a 6900 XT to an 8800 XT 32 gigabyte were they to just barely hit that enthusiast tier performance people want. Yeah, it would be, a third half the performance of a 5090, but if it's $2,500, who cares?
Yeah. I wonder at what point in AMD's roadmap we end up with like really cursed / amazing products where you buy this particular CPU and it's such a good APU that the APUs that cost less than $300 just don't make sense to buy. It's like you buy a CPU that's got 3D stacked, HBM or something, and that's the VRAM, and then all of a sudden it's just like, oh, this one chip it literally is doing it all in a 200 watt power envelope, and you can do 1440p gaming at 100 FPS.
Yeah, I mean, I think if AMD wanted to do it next year with Zen 5, they probably could. I mean, so a rumor, and this one I would say rumor, it isn't something like 3 people, it's 100%, but a rumor I've heard is that late in Strix Halo's development, which the IO die actually uses 3 nanometer with their RDNA 3.5, so for even more efficiency, and because 3 nanometers is so dense for the compute units, but like that they thought, we want to make it just small enough, or at least this is true of the Zen 6 iteration, that can kind of barely fit on AM5 if we only put one CCD with it. Like, if they can do that, and if that rumor holds to be true, I mean, we're there. All they would have to do, it's only a 128-bit, on AM5, but they could take the cut down Strix Halos, pair them with 8 cores, and I think you're getting something that's, I think probably 3060 performance. And I think that's where if you price that even at $400, it's like, you get a $200 GPU, you get a, frankly, $400, they probably do it $500, then $400 CPU. It just, and of course, it's so much more efficient. Low-end GPUs are kind of gone unless you just have an old system that you need to update so you can run more monitors. I think certainly by Zen 6, they will probably do it. I mean, there's even roadmaps that have circulated where it shows 5500 XT, 6500 XT, and then over here it just shows Halo. They're just openly saying the bottom of the GPU market is now APUs, and that will make it a really interesting. They'll be, for budget builders, will be the no-brainer, buy that APU. What will be interesting is what mid-range builders decide. Like if you're someone who is going to go for, I don't know, what would we call this, a 9600 XT. Graphics card that's $350, $400. Are you really going to get that because it's 30% stronger than the APU that's $500 and you don't need anything else? I think that would be an interesting question, especially because we've already talked about how stable it is to just have one APU with no dedicated. There might be a lot of people that just decide to do that for stability's sake.
Yeah, the gaming laptop. That's the only gaming laptop that makes sense based on the Lovecraftian horror in the crash database. Mm-hmm. I don't ever want a gaming laptop. They're all cursed. Yeah,
I'm done with that, I think. So what do you think about NVIDIA's position in the market right now? I mean, do you think they seem to be in a fortified position of unlimited strength in graphics? Do you think it is that? And also, what do you think about the AI bubble potentially popping soon versus in a year or in 2 years? Because I swear I'm already seeing some tremors of that and what's happened in some reactions to earnings recently.
Yeah, I don't know about the AI bubble. I'm constantly surprised, but then maybe there could be a breakthrough, or maybe the breakthrough is not forthcoming, or maybe the breakthrough comes from a couple of college students at Stanford or Harvard or Yale or somewhere, MIT. I don't know. Dealer's choice. I think that Nvidia is transcending the GPU side of it. I didn't comprehend the level and extent to which they had already thought about it. It's they understand that they don't merely have a successful product. They understand that it's a bubble. And they understand that in order for them to properly leverage the position that they're in, they need to incorporate themselves into the people that are buying the most amount of their products. And so Nvidia, like with the Mercedes, robots and everything else, Nvidia is not just supplying the GPUs, they're supplying the expertise. It's like, what's your vision for how you want to use AI? Okay, cool. We're going to build robots. All right. What are they going to do? All right, let's put it together. Because Nvidia doesn't need worthless old money. They need the incorporation of all of these ideas into a cohesive ecosystem. So they are giving away their money basically to their partners to build racks and systems and build things at scale, build networking, build out infrastructure, and build out the intellectual property moats around first mover advantage in all these different verticals. And so Nvidia, in my mind, has almost transcended the entire GPU market. Like they're no longer, they want to sell integrations and systems and the software stack and what Nvidia is building with the cloud and everything else. And so that when their customers come to them and they say, we think that AI will help us do this thing, Nvidia doesn't say, here's the product that does that. They say, let's go into business together, partner, and get it done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also why when it comes to RDNA 4, AMD would make more sense now more than ever to actually price it aggressively. Not because I think they have a chance here where they have this smaller die that punches above its weight, kind of like how the 480 did or whatever, and they can make it en masse cheaply. But also because I don't know if Nvidia would care if they took some market share right now. So like Nvidia's like, yeah, we're making more money over here. Take it, AMD. If you want 10% more market share, this is not that often. Then you could see a situation where it's something I would be thinking about, worried about if I worked at Radeon, is what if the AI bubble pops in a year and then I forgot what comes after Blackwell, but like whatever that is, and that's when Nvidia goes kind of like they did, I think, almost with Maxwell, where they're like, oh, we need to make more money in gaming again. Boom, we're actually going to price our stuff aggressively and take the whole market back one more time. And you want to be in a greater position of market share strength if you're AMD, because I don't know if you agree. I think that's totally a plan Nvidia has, is trying to predict when the bubble pops and being ready with a really aggressive gaming generation when that bubble pops.
I think that Nvidia has made so much money that it just doesn't matter. Like when the bubble pops, Nvidia is not going to be holding the bag. Nvidia is going to be incorporated into so many customers, like people that do digital twin planning and people that do architecture and people that do all of that kind of stuff, that it doesn't matter. Like even if AMD has made inroads and their workstation GPUs are being used for rank and file people that are doing architecture, Nvidia has captured the market of taking those architectural designs and simulating them in some type of metaverse down to the bolt and screw in order to do planning and everything else. And so Nvidia sees more value in being able to do all of that than they do being able to just run the GPU in the workstation. And frankly, AMD can have that market because Nvidia is probably better off using their resources to get more compute and more GPUs to be able to do the other thing than to just provide infrastructure for the rank and file workers or gaming or anything else.
You know, it's funny too, like when you say, if I had to guess, you think Nvidia knows that their stock could lose half its value and it doesn't matter if it's going from 3 trillion to 1.5 trillion. Like I just looked them up, they're at 2.9 trillion now. And it's, God, I think I lived back in Peoria, Illinois, when they announced that both Apple and Microsoft had hit the $1 trillion market cap. And now here we are, and we're talking about a 3 trillion one, just like 4 years later. It's ridiculous.
And if NVIDIA is the one to figure out general artificial intelligence, or NVIDIA products are necessary to execute general artificial intelligence in literally any company that they've partnered with, their market cap is not going down.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, though, like both who would be the greatest or loser in this, like, because we saw what happened with like energy stocks with Enron and the .com bubble. And there were a lot of stocks that weren't bad companies, but everything was so overvalued that some of them went down 99%, they went out of business, but a lot of them went down 80% and finally got back to where they were in the .com bubble in like 2015 or something. Like, I'm curious, like, who you think who would drop a lot and who would drop to the point where you think it could actually be a problem for the viability of the company. And then also, like, if you do see anything, because you kind of hinted that you do, like anything suggesting that this bubble is kind of closer than we think.
I I think that a lot of people, individuals, are disillusioned with what large language models can do for them. Large companies have gotten more use out of AI tooling and AI upgrades than individuals. Individuals, I mean, you can use AI for coding assistant. You can use AI as kind of a writing coach to an extent. You can use AI for, coming up with memes and things like that. But the killer application for the individual has not yet emerged. Think about, the AI plus Copilot PCs. Microsoft really was like, look, you're going to have Copilot and it's going to do all this stuff and it's going to help you. And basically everybody was, of the attitude, I don't want that.
Mm-hmm. Please don't track all my data.
Yeah, I'm not willing to buy a laptop where the feature of the laptop is this laptop is able to do that without running the battery down. Like I can do it on my regular laptop, but the battery will be dead in an hour. But on this laptop, I can get 8 hours of power or whatever. And it ended up not launching with that feature because it was half baked, as it always is. It's like, oh, let's just dump this into an SQLite database. Yeah, no, it wasn't great. So there's definitely a lot of indications that there will be the bubble will pop, but the bubble popping could be a greater economic bubble.
Right.
We found an easy way to automate a lot of information, like take it in the best possible vein. We found a relatively straightforward, maybe not easy is probably not the right word. We found a relatively straightforward way to automate a lot of information economy, information service type jobs in a similar way that, the steam engine maybe would help automate a bunch of labor. And so does that lead to a transformation in the labor market? Sure. And so the bubble popping may not be popping for everybody, or the bubble could pop because the amount of effort required to implement that automation is beyond what most companies are able to afford. Like not everybody could run out and buy, a steam engine, or with the advent of electricity wasn't necessarily deployed everywhere. And then, like the Edison company took over the universe, and then, Westinghouse, and like the rest was history. We will probably have something like that with some of these AI tools. We'll probably have something like that with multimodal AI. We'll probably have something like that with how the data has to be organized, how it has to be ingested, and how it is handled. And we're probably going to get a lot of that wrong the first few times. So there could be a local popping of the bubble, but it will probably take 5 or 10 years for things to really stabilize. And in that time, I think that there's probably going to be multiple little pops here and there for those kinds of things. Because there's just too many people that believe that we're on the cusp of something truly revolutionary. And we probably are. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if we see something that is indistinguishable from what we expect general artificial intelligence to be within 5 years. Large language models by themselves will not lead to general artificial intelligence. It is it's a math problem. It is statistical. It's not, large language models ain't going to do it. But large language models definitely unlocks some learning that we needed a long time ago to do with machine learning and how we approach that. And so maybe some multimodal thing will create something that seems very similar to general artificial intelligence. But it is going to be a lot of labor automation in what we currently consider clerical and office work. So that's going to lead to some labor market changes.
Yeah, it's interesting you say like little pops. I would make the argument we could already be in that. I mean, what have we seen? We've seen like all of a sudden a bunch of developers lay off tons of people, a lot of game devs, and then a lot of programmers, and then a lot and you're like, yeah, but it's not happening at once. Like not all of the people that make spreadsheets got laid off at the same time as these game devs and these artists. And here it's just this one pop there, this one pop there. There will probably be a corporate pop, I have to imagine, where like I would love in a digital assistant that could like answer emails for me and deal with sponsors so I don't have to throughout the day. Make sure I didn't forget to email them for 4 days longer than I probably should have.
Here's the other way you should be thinking about it. We're going to see the billion-dollar sole proprietor, a company that is a sole proprietor LLC that is worth $1 billion. And what's happening here is not that the labor market is messed up or that everything is like pants on fire broken. It's that the individual is able to capture more and more of the value of their labor.
Mm-hmm.
A McDonald's worker is not in a position to capture very much of the value of their labor.
No.
And arguably the value of their labor is not super high. Historically, information workers have been in a better position to capture the value of their labor. Certainly anybody that works at Nvidia right now is feeling very well compensated.
Oh, they're going to have a problem with people quitting that company. They just created a bunch of millionaires and billionaires overnight.
But with tools like AI and microservices and the cloud and blah, 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 individuals are able to better capture the value of their labor than at any other point in history, to an extent. And so we will see a $1 billion sole proprietor probably like a year or two. And it will be an entrepreneur that leverages contracting and leverages the cloud and leverages AI and leverages all of these tools to build a service that people like. And it maybe is not necessarily a killer application. It maybe not necessarily is ABCXYZ. And it's not even necessarily, somebody who's working 20-hour days. It's just going to be somebody with the right idea at the right time with the right whatever. And because of that, I think it's going to be harder for information labor-based multi-billion-dollar companies to exist.
Right. It's not that they won't exist. It's like, why do they have to be so big, though?
Right. Yeah. Like 12 smart people could get together and leverage services and put together something and really, unseat things.
You're already almost seeing that on YouTube, though, with like YouTube news channels and production channels where they've figured out a way to make content that 10 million people watch with a team of 5 to 100 instead of 10,000 or something, like at CNN, or I don't know, maybe people work at CNN, it's probably not 10,000, but like where you can say, well, I just do these shows, they do those shows, this person handles this. And then once you throw AI into it, AI can just help them with all the editing, planning, that, and you could have a full production company that probably hires contractors to help make movies, but the core of the company is like 10 people.
Yeah. I think that you saw that with business methods in the past. So like the early 2000s and the later 2000s, like I'm going to come up with a business method that like, this is my business process. And you can get sometimes some of those things are eligible for patents, like a business method patent is a little more obscure. But you would see those kind of companies pop up and say, like, this is what is happening with supply chain. This is how we do business. This is what we do. And then you have a 20 or 30 person company making copper widgets or, something to solve a very specific niche or something to solve for a very specific industry. And having these tools available means that if you have more of an entrepreneurial mindset, then all of these possibilities open up. And if not people in America, people elsewhere in the world will do this and figure it out. And it is going to be, someone sitting in an entirely different company or an entirely different country could set up a company in America meeting some of these needs, not even necessarily for information, but physical goods as well, depending on who you're able to contract with. Protocase, the people that make cases for 45 drives, it's a business to business thing. Like you go on, it's like, I would like a prototype case for this thing. You fill it out, you do the thing, you just does it. Get it. It's an incredible operation that they have going for the level of automation and how they put it together and the entrepreneurial spirit of it. And that, at the end of the day, you have these amazing, really talented blue collar workers that understand the machines, leveraging their stuff and really capturing the value of their labor in order to be able to deliver that. JLC, I think it's JLC PCB, JCL PCB. It's incredible. I can design a PCIe peripheral. Those components are all in stock. I upload a file. They mail me a board. Like, why don't we have, I would love a business like that in America doing that for comparable rates. That would just be insane. But that is the level of everything that is coming to the future in short order. It's like,
because it's not just AI, it's 3D printing and all of these things that you can automate to do far more things than could ever be automated before by a single person, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like think about like building a piece of furniture 50 years ago. You got to have a guy who's an expert at making this part of the couch, this one who's doing the fabric, but now with like more automated manufacturing, you could see like okay, well, here's the news bubble, here's this furniture like the IKEA bubble, and it's because 5 guys in Montana realized they could take AI to handle their customers, help design the furniture, and they build an app where you custom order furniture that looks exactly like what you want for less money than you can get at IKEA, and they'll just ship it straight to you.
Yep, exactly. And now imagine a whole business, a whole ecosystem built around that kind of thinking. Imagine a visionary at Walmart, or Walmart is going to make available machines to do that type of 3D printing, or even just, an XY table or a plasma cutter or something. And it's like, okay, I can get, these 7 parts made at the Walmart plasma division. I can have these 17 parts made at 84 lumber and woodworking, and I can have these 7 parts made at whatever. And you go online and you buy the parts, you connect with the people that have figured out connecting all of the dots, and then boom, product offered. I mean, that was Walmart's already doing this. Like, think about like when Walmart was offering Bose brand products. They weren't reselling Bose products. Walmart went to Bose and said, listen, you can't handle this volume. Give us the designs for your products. We'll figure it out. And then we're going to sell Bose stuff in Walmart. That's not exactly Bose, but kind of sort of is Bose. We don't have that yet, and we will soon. And when we do, it is going to be transformational to everyday life.
Mm-hmm. All right. I want to bring up something here. It'll probably be the final subject, but it just happened, and I have a suspicion that you're somebody that will have a lot to say about it. What do you make of the CrowdStrike outage? I mean, I've been really busy this weekend, so I didn't really even follow it much more than seeing that there were thousands of flights canceled. But like, I wonder, have you followed that much at all? Or
yeah, they botched an update. Like, there's a lot of like conspiracy theory insanity. I don't buy into any of it. It looks to me like it was just a botched update.
Do you know what the botched update was? Because someone suggested to me it was basically just didn't copy the right file for part of it or something.
Yeah, it looked like it was all zeros. Like, if you just download the update, it's like, what are we updating? And it's just an empty file. It's not empty. It was just filled with zeros, or was incomplete or something like that. And so it literally just looks like a botched update. And the crazy thing is, they botched the update in exactly the same way on Linux in April, I think. And so, like, if you ran Red Hat and CrowdStrike, it failed in exactly the same way and bricked a bunch of Linux machines. And so it's like here's a preview of doing something bad. And it's not conspiracy theory related. It's just like, good Lord, guys, come on. Why did you do this?
Yeah, but because it seems like, well, Florida Man writes in, he says, how can cybersecurity infrastructure become more resilient to bad updates? Like, what sort of process changes need to be put in place to not crash the world? Because it seems like it was pretty, I mean, if I may say, a really boneheaded way to do it too. Like, not something that's should have ever gotten through.
Yeah, it might have worked in the lab, but usually you would test, just randomly pick a bunch of. Microsoft has a lot of opinions on this with how they roll out Windows Update, and Microsoft being a client of CrowdStrike, they probably would have been willing to consult with them or help them. But you can pick a cohort, and it's like, okay, everybody got the update. Oh, no one came back. We should probably hold on updating any more machines until our test sampling of like 20 machines comes back online. Like, literally 100% of them didn't come back. That's weird. We probably shouldn't roll this. There's, now that it's happened, it's really easy to just armchair say, hey, this is how we shouldn't do this. It's actually, there's a certain type of person that you can employ that has this skill set, and they will come up with all of this kind of stuff. And you can't pay them enough. They just, but they'll do the work for free almost, because they just like doing it. But you got to give them a lot of money so that they don't have to think about any kind of like worldly worries or anything like that. And they will come up with all of these edge case scenarios or all of this like really amazing testing, and usually prevent these kinds of things, at least the really obvious things, from happening in the first place. And then they'll add it to a test suite and a test lab. The real problem is that we should go back to the old internet mindset, which is making everything really resilient and bulletproof and hardened, and assuming that nobody has any idea what the other person is doing, and just go with it that way. That was, the ARM laptops. This is kind of related. Nobody wants ARM laptops to have kernel mode drivers, which is one of the anti-cheat things. It's like, oh, game anti-cheats need to be able to run like at bare metal to tell what people are doing. And it's like, if you're cheating, there's actually ways around that. But that does introduce a lot of instability. This is what this instability was, this CrowdStrike, not really a driver, but this CrowdStrike part of the operating system is what introduced the instability. So,
yeah, it seems like kind of to me sounds like there's just too many people on autopilot at this point, working with too many companies that have their hand in making everything all over the world run. And if you're going to do that and you have that many failure points, you can't be on autopilot. You have to have a team that's actually double checking things, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, you brought up Qualcomm, so I don't know. I do want to ask you at least a question about that too. QH Freddy writes and it says, how much of a feeling of it's actually not that bad here have you been having with regards to drivers in the x86 ecosystem now that Microsoft and Qualcomm have showed how bad it can be? And, I'll jump in and say too, like I was recently on a consulting call about Qualcomm, and, I used to talk to someone who had their people that they talk to, like me and my people. And the consensus I basically get is that no one thinks that ARM on Windows is dead, nor that they might not be able to innovate on it a lot next year. But there is this feeling that like Qualcomm just really didn't nail it, and that, well, they will probably get it working, that it might not be fast enough for what Microsoft wants, because it is probably going to take another year.
Yeah, so the way that ARM goes back to sleep for a while is if, and I really hope Intel and AMD are paying attention, is if Lunar Lake and Zen 5 really knock it out of the park, or maybe it's like Zen 5 Plus, or we come out with an AMD Advantage Zen 5, or there's an Intel, special edition Lunar Lake that has the battery life and has the correct working close the lid, wake up thing. If they do that, then if there's a fanless Lunar Lake, if there's a fanless Zen 5, if they do any of that, then a lot of the compelling reasons to use those laptops go away. Qualcomm has got to nail the developer experience. There has to be a developer portal. There has to be a more coherent, it's 2024. Mm-hmm. The development experience is automation, unit tests, having a complete top-down suite for tracking issues, having a relatively transparent process like GitHub and pull requests and that sort of thing for managing updates and managing bug tracking and managing reproducible issues, and for building tests so that you don't have regressions, meaning that, oh yes, we've identified a bug. This is a kind of a big bug. We will also add a thing to our regression tests to make sure that this bug doesn't happen again, which from the June, I got some amazing stuff from a large OEM that was lighting somebody on fire about regressions that happened with the June 10th-ish video driver update from Qualcomm. And, it's just like the DirectX test suite that Microsoft just didn't pass. There's no excuse for any of that. And so all of those things have to be in place and working. Otherwise, you have to throw an unnecessarily large number of developers at manually dealing with the problem. And in 2024, no one likes to manually deal with the problem. They want to make some changes, hit test, and have it tested in some real world scenarios. And AMD has some amazing stuff in their labs for doing exactly this kind of testing on actual real hardware at a very large scale, which is, how it has to be in 2024.
Yeah, I think that's my problem too. Is like when I talk to OEMs about it, it's just an ever-present truth that they don't need to use Qualcomm. I mean, were this to come out 2 years ago with this battery life and these issues, I think people would be like, well, it's a give and take. What do you want? But when you're launching this thing, and Strix is, I think, very likely to just blow it out of the water, and it's really not better than Meteor Lake or Hawk Point. You have to go, well, why use it though? Why have the headache? And from what I've heard, its die size could be like 150 millimeters squared. I mean, this thing isn't that expensive. Professor Next Gen writes, and it says, do you think Qualcomm and Microsoft marketing the X Elite as a high-end solution was a mistake? And my answer is just yes. I mean, it's not a high-end solution.
Yeah, well, they should never have marketed it that way. They never should have said there's 1,800 games working at launch. I mean, even Linus's stream only showed 50% of them roughly working.
Oh, geez. I didn't watch that stream. It was 50%. Good Lord.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's pretty good. And it's like, is it? Is it though? Is it? And so I think it is great for what it is, but because they overhyped it, it's just kind of meh as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And also the $1,000, there's no way that it should not be a dual fan. Like the whole, come on, folks, come on.
QH Freddy writes in and asks, do you think Windows on ARM could eventually develop into Windows running on Mac hardware again, as used to be possible with x86 Macs?
That's a fun thing to think about. Apple would probably never stand for that.
I agree.
I think we might end up getting good Linux ARM laptops, and then Microsoft. It's already possible to run basically everything that matters in the Microsoft ecosystem from Linux using Edge for Linux Office and Teams and whatever else. So Windows is less and less relevant every day, which is apparently how Microsoft wants it.
Well, perfect. So that leads me to I think will be the final question then. Courage Freddy writes in again and says, let's say that Intel collapses in a spectacular fashion and their x86 license is up for grabs as part of the bankruptcy proceedings. Who would buy it and for how much, and what do you think they could do with it? The only person I can come up with is Nvidia, but I'm curious what you think about this, because I've heard people in the Moore's Law Said Discord talk about, oh, what if Apple made x86? I don't think they would. I think they are fine going with ARM. I don't think most other people would either, because you can even see Microsoft pushing ARM. But do you think Nvidia or anyone would want x86 so they could compete in Windows like AMD can?
x86 is definitely not going gently into that good night, but by the time that type of collapse happened, it will have already been replaced in software.
I think because it's not. We'll see what happens, I guess, with Raptor Lake, but it's probably not going to happen in the next year. If it were to happen, that'd probably be something 5 or more years from now. And if that did happen by then, yeah, I think everyone. I mean, look, AMD will have Soundwave out. I think everyone will be totally fine with using ARM by then, anyways. And with how much choice you have with ARM, I think they'll go, why would we prop this thing up again? It's like cab driver medallions. Like,
I honestly thought, like, some of the messaging from Pat Gelsinger with spinning off the fabs into their own business, that he could conceive of a future in which the x86 portfolio was not the most valuable thing that Intel owned.
Oh, I think that's very likely to happen, honestly.
I'm concerned though, because Intel doesn't seem to understand how to be number two, and that is wild to me, because like with Cornelis, I got a bunch of OmniPath gear. We talked about this last time, and I really expected OmniPath to be like kind of a meme, but it's actually nice. And the more that I think about it, like the more that I learn and the more that I play, I can run CUDA over OmniPath. Like, It's fine. It's completely fine. The more that I think about it, the more I think that the only reason that Intel jettisoned OmniPath, or let it spin off into its own thing, is because they weren't satisfied with being number two, which is not a great reason to divest. It's like, oh, we are not going to unseat NVIDIA's moat with Mellanox. Ergo, let's just jettison this.
Yeah, but, I mean, I hear this constantly behind the scenes that Intel doesn't know how to be. Well, that Intel doesn't know how to be number two, and AMD doesn't know how to be number one.
Yeah, I mean, they handed Nvidia the high-speed interconnect market. Although Lisa Spellman now just went to Cornelis, which is actually really exciting for a lot of reasons. But they basically handed Nvidia, who was already hemorrhaging under the weight of deploying Mellanox stuff everywhere, they handed them the entire market. They just basically were telling everybody who was looking at smart interconnects, like, we give up. And so then the lead times for Mellanox gear got even more insane. But also, and Intel doesn't realize this, but I think that is what made the adoption of Ultra Ethernet accelerate so tremendously, which is probably not good for Cornelis networks. But Ultra Ethernet becoming an interconnect it blurs the line between PCI Express and Ethernet and a high-speed fabric for GPUs and everything else, is going to get here so much faster now, because nobody else wants to have to pay the NVIDIA tax on everything else. And so Ultra Ethernet is going to bring a lot of those features really quickly, and the open compute people are going to be really happy with it. And I'm already seeing some really amazing features from the open compute standards being added in NVMe, like the open compute people adding extensions to the NVMe specification to help with things like Fabric and CXL and blah, blah, blah. And things that are parallel, that rhyme with stuff that we're going to need for Ultra Ethernet. But that's exciting that that's moving that fast because of this seemingly unrelated thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm kind of curious what you think, just in general, than what you think Intel needs to focus. Well, they just need to focus on doing things right, really. But I mean, like where you could see it go.
Said it.
Well, I mean, because here's my concern: is just especially if any of these Raptor Lake issues are linked to a problem at IFS, I think it's probably something to do with the design and validation. But who knows? It could be a confluence of multiple problems. I mean, Intel, to become this foundry first company, needs IFS to look good as soon as possible. And so far, all we've seen is Meteor Lake come out on supposedly the most cutting edge node and not have the best battery life. And then if there are any issues with Raptor Lake linked to this, and everyone I talk to doesn't trust Intel to make their products, they'd be so worried they would steal some ideas, or at a minimum, no future roadmaps, and so better position themselves.
Xeon 6 is very good, and that is very encouraging to see. Xeon 6 nailed all of the rather lofty promises that Intel had, and I was not expecting that, to be honest, but they really did nail it. Now, at the higher end, they do have some higher wattage parts, but Xeon 6 looks really good for density deployments. And they have all P-core stuff coming, and but Lunar Lake is going to tell us. So like Lunar Lake P-cores reimagined and crammed into a server CPU socket, and Lunar Lake E-cores reimagined and crammed into the Xeon 6 successor socket, will tell us how things are going to be for that next generation server. But Xeon 6, especially Xeon 6 is a way to replace Skylake and Cascade Lake servers that are still in service, which is beyond a 5-year service lifetime. That is an excellent upgrade path that is way more power efficient, which I'm sure that everybody will really appreciate. And AMD's Intel's kind of figured out the memory controller stuff and the DDR5 efficiency and the noisy neighbor problem. It doesn't have it's one core, one thread, so it doesn't have SMT. But Xeon 6 is very solid, and so the team behind that, I think, got enough oxygen to pull off a huge win. And if that team can keep executing, then Intel is going to have some good server products that are way better than the previous generation server products that they had, which were also compelling values to the enterprise. So I think Intel has a lot going for it. It's just the client stuff is just like, client, what's going on? Of course, Turin's launching pretty soon.
I was going to say, I don't believe Xeon 6 uses Lion Cove. I think it uses Redwood Cove Plus, but it's actually quite a lot better than Redwood Cove in the laptop one, from what I hear.
Well, the only one that's actually launched is the all E-core one, so you can get 144 cores or on up, and that was really good. But that's the old E-cores. Yeah,
and is it really that much better though than like 256 thread Bergamo? And I mean, 384 thread Turin?
Turin is probably going to give a run for its money. So Bergamo at 400 watts, you get 256 threads and 144 cores in 2 sockets is 500 watts total. So 100 more watts versus a 400 watt Bergamo, and Intel wins on almost everything in terms of efficiency per core, and gets close on overall efficiency, because at 400 watts, Bergamo is not as efficient per core. That's a CTDP up configuration. It's not as efficient per core, but you still only have a single socket. The other way that the Xeon 6 wins is you've got physically more memory channels, and that is much nicer. But if you're running a job that needs a lot of cross-socket communication, then Bergamo wins hands down. And so it's like you need a more complex scheduler that's like, let me group these things over here on this socket and these things over here on this socket. Or if you're running, like, if you're selling a very small, EC2 type instances, like here you get 4 virtual CPUs and we're just going to slice this up for a bunch of different customers for 4 virtual CPUs. Xeon 6 is great, and in a lot of ways will lead to a better customer experience than Bergamo. But Bergamo is incredible still, even though it launched a while ago. And so with Turin, if they figure out some of the quality of service things, or if there is specific stuff in the kernel to really tune quality of service, I know Red Hat in OpenShift has some special sauce that they've got in OpenShift to be able to handle these scenarios. Then it's a hot competitive market again. It's going to depend on what software you've got and all that. But think how close that is. It hasn't been that way in a long time.
Right. So you're not necessarily saying it's like a slam run, not home run, a home run from the perspective of like it crushes AMD, but it is, let's be honest, they've been a generation behind for a long time now. And now they're very close to the same performance of what AMD is about to launch, is what you're saying, basically, in a way that should stem the bleeding, or hopefully for Intel's sake would a little bit.
Yeah, it's architecturally, but architecturally they're very different. So like with Bergamo, if you're only running a few cores, you can get some ridiculous performance out of things that are lightly threaded, and you're not going to get that from Xeon 6. Those cores are what they are all of the time. But a lot of the enterprise customers like Amazon, they say, I want a core, I want this core to perform like this, and I want it to perform like this all the time. Think about all those off-roadmap Xeons that Amazon demanded from Intel for all those years. It's like, we don't care about turbo. The server is always going to be 100% loaded. We always want it to be this. This is how we want it to always perform. They basically deliver that with Xeon 6, whereas with Bergamo, depending on what you're doing, the cores will run faster or less fast, depending on GMI link congestion and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens too when they have the Skymont and Darkmont versions of Xeon, because those are significantly faster per core. Anonymous server engineer writes and says, Wendell, in an earlier podcast, you described the issues a company you spoke with faced with Sapphire Rapids delays, and also others that got burned buying Ice Lake Xeons before finding out that they really should have just waited for Sapphire Rapids. I believe you said that many of them decided to just switch to EPYC. Can you give us a follow-up on what became of those companies and how they are doing now? What is it? Was it a trend that continued? Did anyone regret switching to EPYC?
No, everybody that I can think of. I saw that question earlier and I thought about it. Everybody that I can think of has been pretty happy with their switch to EPYC. There's a lot of really funny anecdotes that came out of them. One customer thought that AMD was playing it a little fast and loose with their RAS error reporting in terms of like ECC errors, because they were seeing a substantially reduced rate of ECC errors across their fleet. And nope, just turns out the error rate's lower.
Mm-hmm.
Those Ice Lake Xeons are still in service, but the EPYC counterparts run their jobs really well. There have been integration issues from both Intel and AMD, especially like going off script with certain types of PCIe accelerators or network cards, or like trying to troubleshoot. It's like, okay, where's the bottleneck in this weird performance anomaly kind of thing? But by and large, everybody has been pretty happy with their EPYC deployments. We're just now starting to get a little bit of data on DDR5 deployments, and in some regards, DDR5 deployments have been a little bit of a wild west. I was going to say it's definitely a first generation product, but that is perhaps too harsh. It's actually pretty solid, but not every application is designed with the fact that it is just so darn fast in mind.
And like, in terms of like, if it was a trend, like, is it something you're still hearing as many people are like, I got to get out of Intel into AMD, or is that slowed down a bit from like the Sapphire Rapids delays and all of those issues?
As far as I can tell, data center momentum for people that are AMD curious, let's say, is only accelerating.
Okay. Yeah. So no one regretted it, and there still seems to be a trend there, but at least now Intel has something that can actually compete with them there. And
yeah, there's a lot of people that are really excited for Xeon 6. I think Intel talked about one of their larger customers that was on, I think, Rome in Intel's press presentation for Xeon 6, and they were really happy to move from Rome to Xeon 6, and it was breathtakingly more power efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably accurate.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we covered just about everything we were going to discuss then. Unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about.
Nope, that's it. That's it.
Are you about to eat dinner? You said let's eat.
Yeah, I gotta run.
Okay, I'm sorry. Freudian slip, but thank you for coming on, everyone. I'll do it quickly for you then. Everyone, check out Wendell. Level1Techs on YouTube. There will be links in the description for that. Subscribe to him. Subscribe to me. Ring the bell buttons. Patreon support. All of that. Thank you for coming on, Wendell.
Thanks for having me. And remember, don't panic. It'll be fine. We'll get it. We'll get the Intel thing figured out, or Intel will, and then it'll be fine. Don't panic.
And there's always other competitors too. So, all right. I mean, look, Qualcomm. There's other. Nvidia will make something. We'll be fine.
Qualcomm's going to make an AM5 chip. You heard it here first. No,
exclusively. We'll have to put that in a short and blow that out of proportion. All right. See ya.
See ya.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugada as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Foles, Z Jits, Daniel D, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Daniel Hyde, GZ Ziggy, MJB1, SNES Chalmers, Jem Ferreira, Valcom 11, Jensen Wang, Gregory Ecker, Sarcastro, Chris Drick, Toka, Compress AI Blocks, 30S Boy 08, Hal Booma, Shredbird, Holden Mobley, Sammy Malas, Jordan Simkovic, Huyen Leak, Jonathan, The Boss Haas, Franco Frederick, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Zlicky, Christopher A. Butler, Chrysantine, Stephen Hart, Meat and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Neithra Zink, Mad, Zoot Suit Taylor, Stephen Coates, Greg, Michael McGee, Patty Cates, Gamers Unite, Amiable Chief, Mark Mitchell, Tommy, Ishad, Mark Raidmaker, James Anderson, Cole Addict, Cameron, Henry Zhang, Wesley Sager, D31337 Antics, Michelle Pell, Exapuma, Jamie Witters, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Jeff Settler, Upol 35, Windstar, Corey Leonard, James I, Raider, JSMMH, Little Germany, Mai Sharona, Shay, Milton, Pulse Media, Melodic Warrior, Brett Jones, Chuck Glidden, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Dave Schultz, Austin Haggerty, Justin Bussell, Win Wang, Joe Foot, Brian Scanlon, Hardland, Slushbot, Jensen Angima, Joe Joseph Kelly, Himsick Gung, Tails2299, Neil Valverga, John, Sisyphos 7771, The Forbidden Juice, RB Racer, Brian Wright, AC, Alex Vega, Dr. J Mad, Free D, Brian Michael Cozy, John Swin, Crystal Joe, Elbert Gunn, Jola Martina, Kikum, Solarized 80, Matthew Marlowe, Thalo215, Jeffrey Gentleman, Lord Starscream, Gian Violi, Time Unveiled, Hudat 42, Cordster 671, Penta Winta, Roan McKicky, Sprutnik, Angel of Cake, Omega Doge, Mr. Tiger, John Wick Boomstick, Porcelain Oats, Curry King 3, Nick Zizmania, Sakosha, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.